Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. Welcome to our annual workshop at the Regulatory Science Network Netherlands. It's really a pleasure to be here despite the heat and maybe thanks to the heat that we can still walk freely. We don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of months, but it's great to see you here in person. And today we will be talking about a topic which is very near to my heart, and it would be on patient preferences. So really putting the patient center in our work, and our work, the Regulatory Science Network Netherlands, is really comprising obviously drug development, registration, and also lots of things that go around that. So academic input, the regulatory input, and the industry input there together. And I think today we have really put a group of people together that talk from very different perspectives also on these patient preferences. And it's not just about that, it's also about what you think, and we want to try and make you clear why it's so important. And I will get I have a few slides to aid me in what I want you to steer towards, but my colleagues will also help you in getting there. And there's an interactive panel session where we would like you to talk a lot. There's another session where you are asked to judge yourselves about what is relevant and what is an important and a positive benefit risk. And then finally, this day always ends with our annual dinner and get-together. So for those of you who are there, very welcome. I hope the trains will take you back home again. It was rather hard getting here today. The 2-hour train ride became 4 hours train ride. So it was a bit complex. But very welcome there also, and we would be also launching there the special interest groups on ATMPs, where there are obviously many difficult and interesting challenges to us really getting ATMPs into the approved and developed. So if I press here, I thought maybe, because many of you are probably from the kind of background I am of, but still, it's really important. If you see regulators talk about their job, it's always doing this, because they are weighing benefits, effects, and harms, the harmful effects, the safety. And it's this. I couldn't find the oranges, but it's apples and non-apples, actually, that you're trying to compare. And this makes it a little more concrete for those of you who are speaking Dutch. This is a newspaper article of 2 years ago. It's not about COVID. It's about my topic, and it's actually about cholesterol. The guidelines were changed with a lower target to be reached, and with reaching that lower target of LDL cholesterol, which doctors now should try to achieve, you would prevent 4 non-lethal strokes and MIs. And these patients who would be treated for this period of time, for this 10 years, they would experience 14 adverse effects. And clearly, if you are a prescriber or if you're a regulator, you have now to decide, would you be approving that medicine? Or if you're at the industry, you would want to say, is this something that we can sell? And actually, well, this is maybe not such a bad question to start out with. So who of you would think that that benefit-risk balance of that product is positive? So raise your hand. And I do know I have lots of lights, and I see one only, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then 6? 6. Okay. So now I obviously have to ask the other question, because some of you are shy, and we will see that. Who's not in favor of this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So it's not the same people. 8. So it's a bit equal. And who is uncertain? So then we see if... All right. And they would say, well, we need more information and uncertainty and everything else. Right. Well, let's get to that later on today. I think the issue is, and this is a paper that we wrote at the Special Interest Group on Benefit Risk Assessment, Communication and Evaluation of Medicines, and that's a SIG of the International Society of Pharmacoepidemiology. We really try to say, okay, so you have 2 aspects. You have this benefit risk assessment that has to occur at various cycles of the points of the life cycle of the medicine. And then later on, you have to understand what that also does, how you translate this information. So it is also different audiences, starting maybe in the company where you work, and later on it becomes more public health types of people, people like me working for the regulator, but also for the patient in the doctor-patient interaction. How do I explain these benefits, these apples and non-apples, to the patient on what he can expect of his treatment? And you have to understand if this works, and if not, you have to come back, obviously, to the beginning of the cycle. So today, we will not talk about all stakeholders. We will really zoom in onto the patient. And there's obviously this very nice slide, and maybe Francesco will show it in more detail, is where at the European level we really initiated various points on how to interact more with those patients. Myself, I'm working also at the Scientific Advice Working Party. I think I actually forgot to tell who I am. I'm Peter Mol. I'm working with the Dutch Medicines Evaluation Board, but I'm also a professor of drug regulatory science in Groningen. And in my scientific advice work, that is the work I do as a regulator mostly, we really have these talks about drug development programs. And then at that stage already, there's often input of patients. Are these outcomes really relevant for the patient, do we ask? What do you think of the comparator treatment? Is that really things that you would feel comfortable with? So really that patient input is at various stages of the process built into the regulatory framework. But especially I think Isabelle will tell that we can do probably better on that. Some would argue differently. This is Dr. House, one of my favorite series. But I think we all will try to show today that we do care. Program is quite busy, and I alluded to it already briefly, but we would start out with the patient. How else could we have done? And I'm very happy that Cristina Guerrero Paez is there. Very Dutch lady, but with some ancestry. She will talk about the perspective of that patient. Then we have Francesco from the EMEA, and we're very glad you're also here, Francesco, despite your voice, and we will hear a hoarse Italian voice today. So, then we will get Stan van der Graaf, who will really come in from early development of the drug stage in academia on where does that patient fit in and steers your research. Cathelijne de Gram will tell us a little bit more on that perspective, also in how the industry uses this. And then finally, Isabelle Huys will, before the break, give you an insight on a big European project that has just finished very successfully, also proposing a framework on integrating patient preferences in the regulatory framework, but Isabelle will tell more. After that, we will have presentations with short time to question, but we will do that briefly. And then we will go into the break where we will have really time to discuss with the people that just have spoken, and they will be sitting on the podium and we will have an interactive discussion. So, without much further ado, I would like to go to Cristina and ask you on the podium.
Thank you. Yeah, it goes good. Thank you very much for inviting me here and to share with you a little bit about the view from patients on research. Let's see how this works. Yes, well, I'm not going to forget to introduce myself. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Breast Cancer Association because I think that most of you don't have heard about it. And then I'm going to go into the subject of today, the patient, and what does a patient need, and how can we as patients get into the system. Who am I? Well, I thought I'd take it away with a picture. As said, my name isn't a typical Dutch name. I have Spanish ancestors, but I was born and raised, where's the laser, in Amsterdam. I'm really proud of my family, and I'm really, really proud of the organization that I'm working with for 2.5 years now, the Breast Cancer Association in the Netherlands. I've reached the age of 54, so since a few years I'm really active into health to keep myself health for the future. I'm also a cancer patient, not breast cancer, but another form of cancer. Why is Breast Cancer Association needed? Why is an organization needed? I thought maybe that's a good question to start with. Well, our aim is that each breast cancer patient receives the best personalized treatment for them. And to receive that, we want to help them. And we want to help them with their concerns, with their choices, with their fears, and with support. That's our main goal in a nutshell. We have put it all together in a mission and a vision. And our mission is that we fight every day for the people affected by breast cancer to receive, again, personalized, tailored, and appropriate treatment, care, and support. There are a few words, but they mean a lot. How do we do it? We try to actively, proactively influence all kinds of stakeholders, from hospitals to policymakers, to health insurers, to the pharmacy, all kinds. What do we do? 4 main activities. We provide reliable information, and reliable means, from our point of view, that it is uniform and from the patient's view. We provide support in making decisions. We have all kinds of tools, decisions aids, and other tools to help a patient during a treatment make choices. We stand up for the patient's interests, that's our advocacy. And we provide peer contact, and that is through groups, experience groups to change out experiences, but also themes and one-on-one, our body contact groups. To realize all this, we need funding. How do we work? This is a loop. As you can see, well, there are innovations, there are signals that come to us. Here are a few examples, like new medicines, a lot of new medicines coming up, but also long-term effects, side effects, partnerships, all kinds of different things. They reach us. What we do is, through different ways, try to determine a position from the patient perspective, and that can be with peer groups, specialized volunteers that have joined in one theme, or social media is for us our major source, and our own panel. From there on, we inform patients, and we try, through the advocacy and the lobby, get our position into the development. We're a stable organization. We have existed for this year, we're 42 years old, 6,000 members, and over 200 volunteers. What are we aiming at? In short, these are our 5 focal points. Access to the best care, aftercare, and expertise. That means that we want to, that all 80+ hospitals in the Netherlands have the same treatment and the same quality of care for each breast cancer patient. We have no over and under treatment. There's not every type of cancer, breast cancer, seems life-threatening. What treatment is the right treatment? An important aspect of that is that we are for minimal invasive treatments. The third one, conscious choices, is shared decision-making. Mouthful with a lot of things behind it. For metastatic breast cancer, we have seen that the care path is diffuse, and we are aiming at a fixed point of contact. And early detection is not, like I said, life-threatening. Early detecting life-threatening breast cancer and genetic predisposition is also an important theme for us. We are a small organization who work throughout the whole breast cancer field, and we are a network organization. Without our network, we cannot accomplish anything. Very shortly, our products and services, just to give you a feeling about it. As you can see, for patients, we have a whole wide range of diverse range, from online information to contact to videos that we have made together with the NABON and together with a few hospitals, where we provide information for the patient about the treatment, a little piece about the treatment they're going to receive, and also the decisions aids I mentioned before. We have that's the next one. For healthcare providers, we have also a variety of information we share with them. And for researchers, we have the PAG, Patient Advocacy Group, and all of this is based on mostly on our panel, where we have over 4,000 members that we can inquire with questionnaires. Well, now the big question, I'm just a patient, or am I just a patient? Well, first of all, each patient is unique. We have defined 6 groups within the breast cancer, as you can see, and each group has its own unique problems, its own dilemmas, priorities, care and information. I think it's, as you can see, it's logical. A young woman has different problems than a man with breast cancer. Another example, we have done a project a few years ago where we, in the patient journey, determined 4 types of different patients. What we also saw is that each patient, also there, each group of patients were unique. Each of them, and the next slide is in Dutch, but you see here the 4 patients we named, we gave them a name, it's easier, they're all women. But each of them has different needs on the level of communication, information, but also on the path they're going to take in the patient journey. This slide I'm very proud to present to you. It's the first time from our organization we are presenting it. We have been working for 2 years with a thorough and validated process with researchers, a healthcare professional and patients to develop the breast cancer-driven research agenda. These are the 7 focus points that have come out of it. Well, and in short, well, you can read them yourself, but the first one is what we really want is within the guidelines that, that for each patient there is developed a unique treatment because each patient is unique. For the second one, long-term effects, most studies stop at 5 years, and we know that long-term effects don't stop at 5 years. The third one is improved communication that shared decision-making, as we said before. The fourth one is the metastatic breast cancer, where we are aiming at developing a clear care path and a fixed point of contact. And the fifth and the sixth are, well, as they say there. And the seventh one, we discovered that there is very little known about the psychological consequences of living with genetic predisposition. Oh, one more back. What we are aiming here is we're searching for the latest state of science and practice. So we have the agenda now, and now for the next years to come, we're going to be working on expanding it throughout the field and trying to well, bring it up to the latest state of science and practice. Why should a patient be included? Maybe that's also an important question. For us, it's simple. The patient is the client. He or she is the one who needs the product, if you can speak about a client, but okay. Also, he or she is the one who can tell if the treatment helps. I remember there was a study where there was a promising medicine for patients, but when they brought it into phase 2, what they discovered is that the effect of the side effect was really serious nausea and vomiting. At the end, they stopped the study because the patient said, well, it's nice that you have a medicine that can help me, but I'm going to die from the side effects if I keep on going like this. So that's an important element in the whole process. The patient is the one who knows if the price is worth it. The studies can tell us all kinds of things. A little bit neuropathy. Well, for one person, a little bit can be very damaging. So he or she is the one who can tell if it's worth it. And it's more fun to work together. A researcher, a healthcare, and a patient, different perspectives. It's always more fun to bring it together. How can a patient be included? There are two ways, qualitative, quantitative. Qualitative, we always also say through the patient organization, N does not equal 1. N does not equal 1. One patient is unique, so it isn't always the patient representative, the patient advocate you're looking for. And the patient organization is the organization that can help you achieve the goal. On a level playing field, that's also very important, because a patient is not a doctor, needs other information, other form of communication. Necessary means time, budget, and coaching. Time is an important aspect. Time with planning also. A volunteer, this morning I was talking about it, in the guidelines, there are some guidelines being redirected at the moment, and the volunteer offered to read them, and it has been a few months that she hasn't heard anything. For a volunteer, it's very difficult. You have to wait and get into it again. So it's also important to take a volunteer with you and explain what the means are, with the time, budgeting, planning, etc. From the very start to the very beginning, and in a role that suits the project and the patient. I will later on have another slide regarding the last one. We have at our organization I think 6 years ago, we made up a patient advocacy group where we work together with the BOOG, the Breast Cancer Research Group, and it has been fairly successful. There are about 20 volunteers that are really trained into reading research and giving advice, and the process is also really within 3 weeks, where a researcher comes with a question, within 3 weeks we can give an advice. So it's a good way to work together. And through our B-Force panel, like I said before, if you want more quantitative, we have more than 4,000 breast cancer patients that are willing to fill out questionnaires. Our latest questionnaire was about breast reconstruction and radiotherapy, has been filled out by 1,500 people. What does it take? The matching is important. The right patient representative with the right skills, the right experience, and the right competences. What do you need? What do you want? At what moment also? Maybe it varies during the process. At the beginning of a study, at the end of a study. Is it more a policy-making question? Is it what kind of question is it that you need answering to? So the matching is important with the right volunteer, with the right training and coaching, to help a patient bring in their expertise. Conditions I already mentioned, and the relevance and quality of the project. Is it a project that patients want, that they are waiting for? Is it an understandable topic? And where does it go to? What are the items the patient needs to be informed about? Well, this is the one that I refer to. How should a patient be included? This one goes clockwise. We call it the Patient Advocacy Involvement Circle. And this is the way that you can get patients to be involved. The easiest one, or the lightest form, is only inform. Well, that's easy. You send out a mail and it's done. Consultation is the next one. Most of the time, through the PAC, the Patient Advocacy Group, we advise. And sometimes the advice is really serious, and we take it up, and we in contact with the policymaker or whoever the other party is, we talk about what our advice is and how it can be bettered. Co-production. Now and then there are projects on which we create a co-production. And for those patient organizations that also have research funding money for their own research, joint decision and self-management is an option. A few examples of studies we have been working on or working with together. The NABOR is a recent study that we just this year stepped into a consortium with 6 parties. And we're going to research how the follow-up after breast cancer treatment is provided. It's going to last 6 years. We're going to start with 10 hospitals, and in the end, we want to roll it out to all 80 hospitals. We are in the steering committee, and we're also in the project team. The breast cancer is a study that has recently been finalized. It's a study focused on a new method for breast reconstruction. We were in the steering committee. The LORD study is a study about DASIS, ductal carcinoma in situ. That's a study that has been going on for a lot of years, and that looks into if DASIS, what kind of treatment you need to be given to DASIS patients. And there we have 2 volunteers that have been from the very end, from the very start until now, have been into the project, on the project group. And the Sonia study is a study where the funding organization last year gave it a prize because of the way the patient participation was given form to it. Again, our PAG, we're very proud of it. And I think, yeah, that's it. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you, Cristina, for that insights in the breast cancer patient organization. If there are any clarifying questions, I would like them to be raised now. If not, thank you, and we'll move to the next speaker. Cristina will be coming back on the panel, so we will have plenty of chance to talk in practice. The next speaker will be Francesco Pignatti. He's the head of the oncology group within the EMEA, and will use my mic.
Thank you, Peter. As announced, my voice is a bit challenging, and so I hope all will go well. I'll try to be succinct, which is not easy for an Italian, and let's hope it all goes well. I came to be interested in patient preference studies in my life at the EMEA. By now 20 plus years there. I came from clinical research. I'm a medical doctor and biostatistician, and worked in cancer research before going to the EMEA. And when I arrived, I was a little bit suspicious of drug regulation. It seems to have different rules. We were improving treatments, and this was about, I don't know, drugs being better than placebo. And it wasn't very clear to me how this was going to work. And as Peter said, what regulators do is compare often apples and oranges, as we say in English. But how do you do that? And I guess you do that implicitly a lot. And little did I know that in order to make sense out of all of this, you really need patient preference studies. And this is the only thing I'm going to be talking about today. There are many other aspects of patient involvement that I'm not going to touch upon. I think it's important every now and then to also look at specifically what we can do with patient preference studies, what we mean by them. And particularly, I want to try to disentangle the different components. Why patients? Why preferences? Why studies? I think we've been discussing this a lot, and people start to know what this is about and actually understand what we can do with this study. I think it's time that we can show all together some leadership here and see whether we can innovate the field a little bit. When benefit risk came into drug regulation, it wasn't with a bang. It should have been. But until then, people were talking about quality, safety, efficacy. I understood what efficacy was. Was it p-values and differences in Kaplan-Meier curves? I understood that. But benefit-risk balance, that's a different thing. What is a benefit? What is a harm? Surely there are different perspectives, and Cristina said it better than me. There are actually infinite number of perspectives, objectives, and so what is a benefit or a risk is not straightforward at all. And as regulators, if we want to answer, is the benefit risk positive? Well, we need to say positive for whom, based on what is it that we're trying to achieve. And we don't need to go into what is the right perspective here. Should we just take the patient perspective and just trust it, that that's the best way of deciding? Or should we just take the regulator's perspective and say, hey, that's why drug regulation exists, right? It's because doctors and patients don't know very well what they want, and perhaps we know better. Doesn't matter, there are reasons for paternalistic attitudes and the opposite. I'm not gonna go there, although I have my clear ideas. But the point is that when making such decisions, regulators, we're not trained to know how patients feel about side effects, about signs of the disease, about the effects of drugs. We don't know that. Or perhaps we know that for one or two diseases from experience, or from some form of training. But think of just oncology, where I've worked. And there are thousands of different diseases, hundreds of different drugs, and the combination of those is just endless. So how are you supposed to make sense of it? And actually, the only one who know are patients. So whether you want to decide with your own values, your own beliefs, or whether you ask patients if, according to their beliefs, they consider the benefit risk to be positive, still, you're going to need to know what patients think. So it's kind of, for me, a no-brainer that if we want to be serious about benefit risk and understanding what patients want, well, we need to ask them. And there are proper ways of doing that. And I think the patient perspective is also plausible because in Europe we have so many other systems. For example, just the clinical decision at the sort of bedside, which adopts many different models, shared decision model, more paternalistic models, and so on. So the regulator taking away from all of these decision levels some responsibility, I think for me is implausible. On the contrary, I think the regulatory question should become more if there are patients in the right decision context who think the benefit risk is positive, rather than saying, do I as a regulator with my set of beliefs think that the benefit risk is positive? And to those skeptics that think, wait a second, what about bias? What about lack of autonomy and so on? Well, there are incredible number of safeguards, like the fact that decisions take place in the context of a conversation between doctors and physicians. Regulators can add all sorts of risk minimization measures, for example, and so on, right? So for me, the patient perspective, whichever philosophical framework you take for decision, is a no-brainer. It's needed. Now, what about preference then? What do we mean by preferences? Well, it is about the trade-offs. It is about saying, I prefer apples to oranges, because you're comparing all sorts of things, and you can't really say apples are greater than oranges, but you can say, perhaps I prefer one or the other. And in our sort of jargon, this would be, do we prefer a drug to placebo? And how we study preferences, well, when we submit the recent papers to clinical journals, they get rejected, sort of desktop rejected, like, what are you talking about? Preferences? This is psychology. Go to a different, literature here. And I think the medical environment has not quite realized that there are half a century of behavioral economics that has developed this field. Equivalent of Nobel Prizes in economics have been won on this type of stuff. And we struggle using it. And so I still remember when I came to EMEA, the first thing I looked was the assessment report for Taxotere. It became the first oncology drug approved in the EMEA building. So I wanted to look at the assessment. And these incredibly wise regulators had come up with this sentence in the end. That was it. Okay, you didn't have benefit risk in the legislation at that time, but that was it. This was the conclusion, which is phenomenally efficient if you want, but it doesn't really say much about either the justifications or what's behind it. And after legislation introduced benefit risk formally, we started to think, well, if we're going to be serious about it, we need to explain be explicit about a number of things, and introduce a framework based on behavioral psychology and other theories. So it's a formal framework. And if we look at the benefit risk assessment recently, well, wow, It's not a paragraph, it's, 8 pages. It's good, it's good. There is some structure there. There are some elements which are probably communicating important things. But when it comes to trade-off, luckily you can't see it, but you still see things like, yeah, we think the effects are clinically relevant and the toxicity is manageable. Somehow hiding behind a cloud of words and not wanting to sort of become explicit about these things. What we could be doing, and what we actually did, was why don't we do a patient preference study? And we asked a patient group for help, and this was a myeloma group in the UK, and we asked them about 3 attributes of a drug: 1, efficacy, 2, safety. It doesn't matter so much what they were. And we collected the importance that patients give to these attributes. And aside from understanding which patients value certain attributes more, which is perhaps not critical for the decision, but certainly helps informing other decision makers, we were able to say, look at the second bullet point here, we were able to say that with some assumptions, 76% of patients would prefer the drug to placebo. Now that's a way to be transparent about your decision. That's a way to communicate what is the strength of evidence that you have for that benefit-risk assessment, and not just some type of implicit statement, we think this is good for marketing authorizations. And kind of gives meaning to what we do. If we just tick the box, yeah, the p-value is less than 5%, and yes, toxicity is less than 40%, it doesn't really mean anything. Here, you have a clear translation in what this means for patients. 76% of patients maximize their utility taking the drug compared to placebo. So I think it's another no-brainer for me. And the third thing is studies. Okay, this is all interesting, but do we need studies for this? And we don't exactly have a track record in Europe of being very efficient about the way regulators demand studies to be conducted. And I think now that we are in a phase where we are implementing new standards and so on, we have to be critically aware that whatever the regulators come up with, and hopefully this will be in a sort of internationally harmonized framework, can be misinterpreted and will be misinterpreted and overinterpreted. And we're going to end up very likely with some sort of a super expensive machinery to conduct preference studies. And this we have to avoid at all costs. I mean, we cannot keep generating inefficiencies in the system. And just to give you an example, that that patient preference studies do not have to be a 1,000-patient study. We're trying to apply this also in small focus groups. Like today, when we have a question for patients or doctors, we ask them, hey, what do you think? Are these benefits important and these risks? And then we get some sort of an answer, an opinion, and that's it. But what if we were a little bit more formal and we asked in a focus group to be more explicit? And the feedback we got from some of this experiment was actually excellent. And we want to do more of this stuff and actually think how these patient preferences can be implemented also in a small focus group like the advisor group, in our day-to-day decisions. In fact, it's methodology that applies very broadly. And we have the backing of years of collaborative research that we'll hear more about later, which I won't go into detail, but just to say that it's a fantastic opportunity now to have all of this come together and take this as a basis for upcoming work. As all the fields of science, this is not complete, and this should not be an excuse for not doing patient preference studies. There is more research to be done. But this is work that we will need to do together. So why are we not swamped then with the patient preference studies if it's so clear to everybody? Well, it isn't so clear to everybody. And I think many of us still lack familiarity, still think this is some sort of a subjective realm where objectivity is not possible. No, we use preferences every day, and there is a whole science of doing this properly. There is a lot of anxiety of, what if we do this and then it shows the wrong thing, or the regulators don't like it. And I'm actually curious to hear from industry what are the challenges at the moment. And in our sort of self-critique, we need to think also that for regulators to be very explicit about what we do and what are the value judgments that we use when we do benefit risk assessment. Well, it's more transparent, and transparency takes more courage if you want to be explicit about these things. So until we are pushed into it, well, we hold back a little bit, and what I call the squid technique. But aside from the challenges, this is something that we see whenever there is change. I think we really have an opportunity here to take some responsibility and show some leadership here. We have methods. We hear that patients are ready, they're organized. We have patients group who are willing to participate in these studies. We heard from Cristina, and they're very motivated, high response rates. Well, it's up to us to show that we can produce a more mature regulatory system with regulatory claims that are more substantiated, regulatory decisions that are more transparent, and overall a system that delivers for the patients as it should. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Francesco. That was nice and concise, I think, and really stating we need to do something, but we need to do it also efficiently. So I think we will have really plenty of room to discuss it further. I think the next speaker will be Stan van der Graaf, who will be really giving that academic perspective of the early investigator. Gewoon doorklikken.
Hoe start je hem?
Volgens mij gewoon door. Zit dan achter.
Ah.
Ja. So, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, particularly Larissa, I guess. I was a bit surprised because I'm not a regulatory scientist at all. I'm also not a medical doctor, so I don't really see patients on a day-to-day basis, but apparently that's probably the reason I got invited, because I can show you some examples on how we included patients in preclinical research as well. So I focus on rare liver disease. So I'll start with two events that we co-organized with patient organizations. Not so much on the content of these events, but more on the rationale. So what was in it also for me as a basic scientist. And also the lessons that we learned by organizing this. Eventually this led to a joint publication. I'll also explain a little bit why we did this. Influence on research, and then finally, some remarkable differences. The last part is the most distant from my expertise, but still I wanted to put it in there. So these events. So why did we organize them? So I'm head of a department called Tijdgeld Institute for Liver and Intestinal Research. There are about 70 researchers, 30 or so working on liver, 40 on intestine, all preclinical translational research. Many have a medical background, but also many have not. So I studied chemistry myself. And focusing on the liver, we have common metabolic diseases, but also genetic and autoimmune diseases, and we'll focus on that part. So questions that we like to answer are, so what underlies these diseases, so particularly where bile flow is disturbed. So I guess you all know that the liver produces bile. If this goes wrong, it gives a lot of issues in the liver. So how is this regulated normally? So that's, of course, not really patient-related. If you talk about health, so which molecular targets for therapy, that there, of course, a patient contribution can be really an advantage. And also mechanisms underlying drug side effects. Anyway, we are these researchers, every day working in the lab, never seeing a patient. So that, for me, sounded really strange. So I was spending, at that time, almost a decade or so trying to come up with novel therapies and understanding rare genetic diseases that lead to cholestatic liver disease, so which impaired flow, but I never ever saw a patient suffering with such a disease. Well, every day you go to work, and of course I think I have the best job in the world, but sometimes we have PhD students that have the bit of a dip in motivation, and I thought, well, this might be very motivating to have the scientists actually meet patients and to know, why are we doing this? What's the long-term use? On the other side, of course, there are patients that might learn from their doctors, or they look at clinicaltrials.org, what might be their next therapy, and particularly for the disease I study, there is currently no therapy available at all. So maybe there are these patients that are interested in what's coming next, but what they might not realize is that there are these relatively high number of scientists already in phases much earlier. And of course, that will not help these individual patients next year, but on the long run it will, and I think that can also be motivating to realize that you're not alone, you're part of a bigger endeavor that will hopefully come up with solutions later. So then Marleen Katé from PSC Patients Europe, Anneke Mels from the Maag-Lever-Darmstichting, the Digestive Disease Foundation, José Willemsen from the Nederlandse Leverpatiëntenvereniging, me sat together in 2016, and that was also the year that this organization planned to celebrate their 35th anniversary. So then we decided, let's organize an event together where patients with a rare liver disease and researchers, can be clinical researchers or laboratory researchers, meet. So that's what we did. It's really a joint effort. So we had some aims. I'm not going to read it all out loud, but the first aim is to introduce researchers to patients, so more or less what's in it for the researcher, then to explain to a patient how he or she can be more involved in research as well, and provide some tools. And finally, I think this is the most important part of this day, was to create a bit of a group feeling. So how can we help each other? So first we had some lectures. Then we had workshops, really small groups of people sit together and also discuss them afterwards, and there were some posters. Well, here I try to be a bit more anonymous, so that's why I'm on the picture. But anyway, you had a whole sort of summary on each list on what should be done in the near future on patient research connection. So then the next year, we had another event which was quite similar. Again, the initial trigger to organize this, and also the financial means, was that the Nederlandse Vereniging voor Hepatology, so the Dutch Association for Study of the Liver, existed for 40 years. So then we had short movies of patients together with researchers and clinicians all together, panel discussions, also roundtable discussions, and all this together. So I think it's a second event which also worked quite nicely. So what did we encounter by organizing these events, which was for me quite new? So one is a challenge is in funding. So it's not always easy to organize something like this. So we could do it by linking it to celebrative events of organizations. I think that's a good incentive. Reaching the right audience can be quite tricky. So for me, it's quite a challenge to reach a good patient cohort. But of course, that's the task that they covered for us. And then, yeah, for me, some new things I didn't think about it before organizing this. So suddenly you have to start thinking about walking distance. If I only invite scientists, I very rarely think about it. Maybe I should more. What type of lunch can you provide or not? So there should be a little bit more emphasis maybe on dietary restrictions. Planning and fatigue. So if you plan a full day event, that might not be the best idea, particularly with liver disease, because that gives a lot of fatigue, like many other diseases. Here I'm guilty right now. So as scientists, we are pretty used to giving speeches, which are sort of one-directional. If you try to establish a dialogue, yeah, you should also be more open to receiving information. So how do you plan this in a meeting? And this was something I was personally very afraid of, and it turned out to be a bit of a non-issue. I was really afraid that I would provide false hope. I'm going to provide with a therapy, maybe it will take 10 years, but it will come. Well, of course, if you have to be realistic, I don't know the exact percentages, but I think quickly 9 out of 10 of our conceptual strategies never even make it to the clinical trial. But this, I think I very underestimated patients in general. They understand this process very well, and you can explain it very well. That's also not the aim. So if you know, okay, this is really preclinical data, that was quite easy to understand. So what left is the inspiring future possibilities. And then, of course, a little bit on privacy and photos, which is still the most challenging part still is the follow-up. So if you start to organize something like this, what is the next event? How do you meet again in the future? Well, for me, that follow-up was clear in a joint publication with Larissa. So we talked to the editor of this journal, which is one of the leading journals in my field. And they said, well, okay, this is a nice idea to write such an opinion story. I'll tell the content in a bit, together with also a patient representative. So we did, and it got accepted. So I think that really helped us. And now we explain a little bit what. So this is a liver, and these are the bile ducts. And of course, you know that bile has several functions, but one of them is to get rid of toxic waste products. Also is to get some correct products into the intestine. Unfortunately, the content of bile is rather toxic. So if there's a blockade somewhere over here, the liver will eventually suffer quite a bit. If this liver gets damaged, you get even more restrictions in bile flow, and it gets worse and worse and worse. One of the diseases that has sort of this mechanism is called primary sclerosing cholangitis. So sclerosing, I explained, so there's scar tissue. Cholangitis is an infection in these bile ducts. Unfortunately, there's no therapy. So the disease characteristics, so it's mostly male. It's a bit vague. There's a female here as well. I'm not sure why that has disappeared. People sometimes can get jaundiced, so a bit more of the yellowish skin. The majority of PSC patients have inflammation in the gut, so that can also be the first symptom that they present with the doctor. So they have quite severe colitis. And then there are these four aspects. So they have a lot of itch, fatigue, and a high fear of cancer, because in these patients there's a much increased risk of in cancer in the cholangiocytes, so the bile ducts, but also in the intestine. And why did I come up with this slide? Because it was almost provided to me by the Patient Foundation. So they did an inquiry. So in a larger group of PSC patients, so what bothers you most? And for me, that was really nice, because then I could actually put it on this slide. Because I think if you just read the literature, typically it's a bit limited to this. So a bit of epidemiology, a bit of some parameters, maybe some liver enzymes, what else is going on in different organs. But you don't really see a lot of these type of aspects in the first sort of introductory paragraphs, at least in the scientific journals I read. Well, I think it is important to include. So I told you that we wrote this paper, so what is it about? So we had two types of drugs that were approved for other cholestatic disorders, or close to approval. So one is a drug that lowers bile salt synthesis. It talks about these toxic metabolites, mostly bile salts. And the other is that drugs that increase excretion of bile salts via the feces. So they inhibit uptake in the intestine. So both give a sort of protection of the liver, and this gives improvement in liver enzymes, which is a pseudo marker for liver health. You can measure in plasma, rather indirect. The problem with A is that it increases itch, which is a bit of an unfortunate thing if you try to come up with a disease where most patients complain about itch, many people, and the other induces diarrhea, which is again not really convenient if you have a disease which already has an intestinal issue as well. The diarrhea comes from the bile salts in the colon. However, therapy B reduces itch. So we proposed to have the combining strategy. And it's also led to some research, which we're doing still now. And now we have experimental evidence that supports this hypothesis. In this opinion paper, we also try to encourage pharmaceutical industry to either collaborate or to combine these two drug strategies. A second line of evidence is on current research. So this is, again, a different strategy. I explained that cholestatic liver disease in essence have a problem with bile efflux. So my hypothesis, and I think every one of you could have imagined this, if you then also reduce the influx, that might be beneficial. Strangely enough, in the field, this was highly debated, but I'm not going to go into detail there. So we tried this hypothesis. Is it true? So in order to do this, we needed to know what is the influx pathway, and it's this particular protein, which is my favorite protein, called the sodium taurocholate co-transporting polypeptide, NTCP. And there we got really, really lucky. So we needed to inhibit this transport protein. And there it turned out that this bile acid transport protein, by chance, somewhere in evolution, I don't know why, turned out to be the docking receptor for the hepatitis B virus. And people were investigating tricks to block this viral infection, because apparently even after people are infected, it's still useful to block infection of the next hepatocyte. So there was a drug which is now called bulevirtide. It's also conditionally approved. And it also inhibits this transport, so I could test my hypothesis. Unfortunately, this drug requires daily injection. So we tested in preclinical models. I told you I was working in a lab, and it worked. So I'm quite proud of this paper, exacted in hepatology. And this led us to my current research, which is to develop orally available small molecule inhibitors. Of course, I'm not doing this by myself. There's a whole a bigger collaboration with medicinal chemistry involved. But I think this is mainly driven by the wish, from me, but I think also from patients, to shift away from daily injected peptides to orally available drugs. Why? Because we probably need to take them for decades. The patients need to take them for decades. So then decade-long daily injection is not really ideal, and also very expensive. This brings me to the last, and that's the part I'm least sure about, but I thought, well, maybe to trigger you a bit also for the panel discussion is, some remarkable difference I noticed in endpoints. Why is this distant from me? I don't do clinical trials. I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but there is some example here. So this is an example from pediatric cholestasis. So this is one of these drugs that blocks bile salt uptake in the intestine. So if you look at the primary endpoints, then this is a part which is sort of a biochemical parameter, fasting bile acid levels. That's something you can measure in plasma. And here are secondary endpoints. One is an enzyme which you can measure in plasma again. So again, very objective was the word I just heard. But here is another secondary endpoint which is called pruritus. And this is either measured by the patients themselves, but because it's pediatric, sometimes also by the parents. So I think that makes perfect sense, because you look at liver health, but you also look at how the patient sort of senses on a daily basis what this is doing on their well-being. If you look at the adult form of cholestasis, so this is also a drug which is now approved. The primary outcome is only biochemical endpoints, the secondary outcome as well. And I looked at it yesterday again. There's not a single patient-reported outcome in this description at all. In fact, if you look at the inclusion and exclusion criteria, it says patients with severe pruritus will be excluded. Yeah, of course, there are a lot of good reasons. It of course has been discussed in detail, but for me as a non-expert, I was a bit surprised that you have a disease which is characterized by itch, by fatigue, by fear, and that at least one of these characteristics is actively excluded from the patient criteria. Now, of course, it's been approved, and now we know, because this drug actually induces itch. So a patient that did not have itch at the beginning can actually develop itch afterwards. So personally, I don't think it will be a very successful drug. At least it will not be appreciated much, but it is an extra option, and it is beneficial for the liver as a whole. That brings me to my last slide. The acknowledgements, of course, the people that helped me organize these events, and also that helped me with writing the paper, and the people in the laboratory that did these preclinical studies with me. So that's it. Thank you.
So thank you, Stan. Very nice that everybody sticks to the time schedule, so we're really going smoothly through the program. And Cathelijne, I know you have to take it off. It's nice for the picture without.
Take it off. Oh, sorry. Oh, for the pictures.
Well, we just have to look beautiful today. Welcome also today, and really that industry perspective, also what we do with these patients in our development program. So I think it's really helpful that you give that perspective. I think thereafter there's only one more presentation, and we really will get you brewing over the break of what you want to ask. So really please think of what is now the next question we'll ask the industry. So Cathelijne, please go.
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me to this workshop. I very much appreciate to be representing industry. I'm, as an industry representative, I also have my specialism, so I'm not representing everything on patient engagement from every angle. As you understand, I have a background in regulatory affairs for more than 20 years at EU level, so that is my expertise. And I'm very happy to be here today. Oh, sorry, I need to... Should I...
No, just, sorry, just...
Yeah, no problem. And so, I'm currently working at Janssen. I used to work as somebody interacting on product development and focusing on getting products through drug development and product approval, and of course also post-marketing from every aspect at EU level. But nowadays I'm, after more than 20 years focusing on that, I moved to a regulatory policy position. And one of my focus areas is patient engagement. So just a disclaimer, perhaps typical industry to say that these are my own opinions. During my presentation, I would like to give a very high-level overview of the current status of patient experience data that are used in drug development and regulatory decision-making. And so first of all, why is it important to generate patient evidence as part of drug development? Well, you get better designed clinical studies that could improve the recruitment, the speed of bringing drugs to the market, as well as more convenience for the patient. Of course, as Stan already mentioned about clinical endpoints, study endpoints that are meaningful to patients, and also to understand patient preferences with regards to their treatment. Patient engagement in drug development and as well as the inclusion of this data in regulatory submissions is rapidly increasing. This is a figure taken from the FDA. I think it's quite similar in Europe. So 80% of the new applications actually include patient experience data in its applications. So, what is patient engagement and what is patient experience data? First of all, patient input. Patient input, that is kind of the highest level, the most generic level, that consists of a wide range of information and perspectives from patients. For example, I think most of us with regulatory backgrounds are familiar to that, input of patients at scientific advice. Then more specifically, patient perspectives. That relates to patients' experiences with the disease and its management. These can be divided in two key elements: patient-reported outcomes and patient preferences. And I will go a bit more into details on these. PROs, or patient-reported outcomes, provide a snapshot of the patient's own assessment of an outcome at a given point in time. But they do not convey how much the patient values the outcome or the therapy. And that is actually what, as mentioned earlier, what patient preference studies can do. So just to highlight patient preferences versus PROs or patient-reported outcomes, we tend to say PROs at our companies. A patient preference study is a quantitative or qualitative study to assess the desirabilities which relate to the benefits of a drug, as mentioned at earlier presentations, and the acceptability, which relates to the risks of a drug. These types of patient preference studies can contribute to the benefit-risk assessment of a drug, as mentioned earlier. Patient-reported outcomes, like health-related quality of life measures, or the itch PRO, as mentioned by Stan, are included in the majority of drug clinical development programs. A very recent article was published actually last month about oncology submissions to EMEA in the period of 2017 through 2020. And this article shows that 78% of all applications do include patient-reported outcomes. Of those, 18% are reflected in the labeling. From a regulatory perspective, I'm touching upon this because it is a relatively new area, and within my company, we have a very good and dedicated team that is working on PROs and is coming up with using existing PROs that are quite straightforward, because then you would be incorporating those in your scientific advice as a potential endpoint. But very often there are also novel PROs that like, for example, the itch reported outcome or fatigue reported outcomes that are being enhanced. Those endpoints can be included in clinical trials, but in order to become part of an EMEA and be evaluated as part of an EMEA, those need to be validated, just like any other endpoint. This happens as a standalone procedure through EMEA, so not as part of a scientific advice for a specific medicinal product, and that procedure is called qualification of novel methodologies, just like IMI Prefer went through. The procedure provides a lot of excellent feedback on your plans on how to qualify it, and also the assessment of the data by EMEA. However, the procedure is very long because it just takes a very long time to develop the plans and to generate the data. So if you're unfamiliar with the procedure, you might consider that this is a one-time interaction with the health authorities, but in practice it is iterative and it's taking years. And that is not just at my company, but in general, as you can see if you would go to the EMEA website on qualification procedures. That's why I wanted to highlight that. Then patient preferences. Oh, I just wanted to go back. What I also wanted to highlight is that so there is a good procedure at EMEA on PROs, either through scientific advice or qualification advice. And in general, industry includes those in marketing authorization applications. They do get reflected in EPARs and, if possible, also an EUPI. So from a transparency perspective, it might not say this is a patient-reported outcome, but those are reflected in the majority of the MAAs and as well as EPARs. Then coming to patient preferences, they provide valuable information, as mentioned, about benefits and risks, and which trade-offs are acceptable, and how do these patients think of these trade-offs. And I think Cristina also was looking into subgroups, and that's also mentioned here. Are there subgroups that have specific preferences? And then comes the question on the regulatory pathways. I think in general, I can say that an average regulatory colleague is not that familiar yet with patient preference studies, as they are relatively new. And it's also not written in EU guidelines. So that makes it a bit far away for the average person, and they may not particularly know what to do with it. They can see the value of it, but they don't see any cookbook on the EMEA website on how to integrate that information into their MEA. Although they would consider it as relevant. So what I wanted to highlight is that there's no specific guidelines at this moment on methodology and how to include it in your MEA, and also not how it's being used through regulatory decision making. I think this is work in progress, as these types of studies are relatively new. I'd like to hear more from Francesco on this. So I'm pretty sure that will be coming in the near future. However, it doesn't mean that because there are no guidelines that you should not include it. And at Janssen, we do include it. If it is available, we do include it in the scientific advice briefing books as well as MEAs. I was asked to provide an example, and of course I'm very happy to do so. I have to say that, for example, Bennett, who's the last name on this, he's also part of the IMI Prefer Consortium. He has been leading this patient preference study. This study was performed in 2017, 2018, and was used as part of the Spravato submission. And everything that I'm saying right now is in the public domain, so if there are further questions, I can see to what extent I'm able to answer that. So, what the team did, they developed a discrete choice survey, and they conducted that survey amongst phase 3 trial participants, as well as ketamine treatment-naive panelists. And they did this to evaluate the relative importance of benefits and harms associated with treatment, and also to quantify the maximum acceptable risks that patients would accept for the treatments to relieve depression. This Spravato is used for a very severe form of depression that is treatment resistant. Just to see if I'm reading it all. So participants evaluated hypothetical depression treatments defined by varying levels of improvement in depression symptoms. So time to response, transient post-dose issues, so things that would appear quite quickly but would also disappear, like for example, dizziness, but also potential long-term risks that were still not shown by the drug because the drug was still in development, but these were potential risks that were associated with ketamine abuse, so those were included as well. Interestingly, the clinical trial as well as the panel respondents had similar preferences. Most patients and panelists indicated a willingness to accept significant long-term risks and to really realize improvements in depression. There were very few differences between the samples. The post-dose transient issues with esketamine, which is Spravato, was relatively of a little concern to most participants. The study took about 1.5 years to conduct, and after that, of course, the data still needed to be analyzed and written down. So these studies need to really start on time, otherwise you will not be able to use them as part of your drug development program. That's something to take into consideration. On the next few slides, I would like to provide insights on how these patients' experience data, the PROs, and this patient preference study was actually used by the sponsor, so Janssen in the United States, as well as the regulator. The example that I'm giving relates to the US situation, as this is the information that we published. And also the regulatory situation is slightly different from a transparency situation in the US. So what did the sponsor do? The patient experience data that were collected, so both the patient-reported outcomes as well as the patient preference study, was included in the NDA of Spravato. And the collection of patient experience data and including them in the NDA is particularly important for conditions such as depression, because objective skills to assess prognosis are lacking. Besides including the information, the ECTD, patient experience data were also discussed with the agency during clinical development, and also was provided as part of the advisory committee briefing book, as well as at the presentation at the FDA advisory committee meeting. So I think, interestingly, I don't know to what extent people are aware of the FDA guidelines. I was not, to be very honest, until I saw this. Just like EMEA, FDA is encouraging the collection of patient experience data in clinical trials and to capture and support the patient perspectives as part of regulatory filings. FDA is required by law to publicly report the type of patient experience data that are reviewed in a new drug application that are used to inform the regulatory decision making. So what did FDA do? They created this, they call it the PED checklist, which is this document which they include in their clinical review document. And there it's clearly highlighted what type of information was submitted. So on the top you can see the patient-reported outcomes and other clinical outcome measures. The patient preference study is highlighted, whether other type of patient input is gathered, what you can see from patient participation at meetings. Another option is, and I'm sure that still happens in some applications, that there was nothing submitted as part of the submission, but at least it's provided in a very transparent way. From the reading the FDA clinical review document, you can see that they extensively reviewed the patient experience data, they extensively discussed it. And what is also visible is that the patient preference study was actually used in the regulatory decision-making. So that was very positive news, that the patient voice, especially with this type of drug that is esketamine, that the patient voice and the importance of having such a product on the market did have a right place and did contribute. So the EU situation, well, I think we all are aware that patient engagement is also a very hot topic in Europe. At this moment, as Francesco already referenced to, the ICH is generating a patient-focused drug is a patient-focused drug development guideline, which will, of course, once available, also be applicable in Europe. And besides that, EMEA is actively involving patients in their scientific advice meetings and regulatory review of documents. The EMEA Regulatory Science Strategy to 2025 also really reinforces the patient relevance in evidence generation. And I think what is a really important next step is, and I'm very curious to hear the outcome, is that later this month there will be a multi-stakeholder workshop organized by EMEA on patient experience data in medicines development and regulatory decision making. So I'm very much looking forward what the discussion, I'm not part of it, but my colleague from Merck, Susan Batty, will be there. I'm very curious whether that will take the patient experience data a step further in Europe, and especially also making it more visible to regulatory colleagues in Europe that it does have a place in marketing authorization applications and also in the regulatory review of those. My conclusions. My idea of going into industries is to bring the best treatment to patients and to really put patients in the center. And these types of initiatives that are now evolving around patient experience data are really contributing to that. Although at this moment there may be a bit of a lack of clear guidance on how to use this type of data and integrate this type of data in Europe, I think we all agree that please go to your regulator and discuss this type of information with them through scientific advice or through other means. I just have one more slide and then I will finish. And that is EFPIA, which is the European Trade Association for Pharmaceutical Industry. They are also very keen on the transparency of patient evidence in regulatory decision making. And they just issued a position paper on this. Besides that it's a position paper to be more transparent on patient experience data, what I would also like to indicate that it also provides a very nice overview of the regulatory status in Europe and in ICH as well as FDA. So just as a background reader, it would also be a very good read. So thank you.
Thank you, Cathelijne. I think you really highlighted a number of issues where we are working on, because I think in the ICH guideline where I worked on and actually signed off today, really another guideline, we had this FDA colleague and he always said, visit your friendly regulator. And that's for all those cases where it's unclear what we really want to have. So I think you really highlighted a couple of aspects. And as Francesco said, obviously, we don't want to increase the hurdle for coming to us and add something that is unsuitable or not really necessary, but there are really ways we want to get these patient preferences in, and how do we do most efficiently. And I think we'll talk a little bit about the mechanisms, how we interact, but Isabelle will tell you how she conquered this regulatory, frame and talk about bringing patient preferences to the regulator and the industry, on understanding that what are we doing and how do we really try to use it also. So Isabelle, welcome. Professor from Leuven, I should say.
Thanks for this nice introduction. Good, thanks a lot for the invitation, also for being here and for presenting you research and also findings, insights from what we have been doing in the context of patient preferences. So my talk will go on the outcomes of PREFER, an IMI project, a European IMI project, but also some future topics on research and other interactions that are very important in this field. My name is Isabelle Huys. I'm a professor at the University of Leuven in Belgium, and there we have a research group on regulatory sciences. But for the moment, we have also built out a patient preference research center together with my postdocs, Rosanne Janssens and Liese Barbier. And we will indeed discuss all these aspects with you. So I would like to start with presenting you a just actual situation where we have today medicines that come on the market that have overall survival benefits of 2 months. Some other medicines offer survival of 3 months, but may come along with some side effects. Some medicines are so, let's say, complex that they may indeed produce extreme tiredness for patients. And that is actually a difficult choice to take, not only for the regulators and for decision makers. Okay, what is here the best medicine? Which one can we afford on the market? Because indeed we live in very extreme budgetary constrained times today, where regulators need to make choices. A lot of very innovative biologicals are very expensive, so choices need to be made. And that is actually where the regulators, but also the payers, are curious, not only from their own perspective, indeed, which medicine can and should we allow to come on the market, but also what would patients do, and what is actually the view of patients, what is actually the preferences that patients would have. Regulators, payers, others are used to include in their decision maker, base their decisions on more quantitative data from RCTs or randomized clinical trials. And that's indeed how can we translate the view of the patient, so the patient preferences, into data that is understandable also by these decision makers. So that's what regulators and developers and payers need, qualitative and quantitative data that are useful along other types of data, such as clinical trial data, and to know what are the trade-offs that are there. But that's not an easy way to do. That's not an easy exercise. It's very difficult to do that. And here, patient preference studies come along. Patient preference studies are studies that may generate such qualitative and quantitative data that may be used by these decision makers to bring them more close to the view of patients. And PREFER is an IMI project that has worked on all these aspects. They have been revealing what are the preferences of patients in several disease contexts. We have been using neuromuscular diseases, lung cancer, but also other rheumatoid arthritis and multiple myeloma, and in hemophilia and other disease contexts. What data is really useful for decision makers along the nice-to-have data, so which data is indeed needed. We do not need to do these preference studies just for doing them. It's really having a right decision on that. What methods are reliable? There are indeed, as Francesco said, a lot of the methods already available from behavioral science, behavioral economics, but which are useful in the health context, and which are now in a particular disease area with a particular sample size useful, how to avoid bias, and how to ensure that the data that you produce are so robust enough so that the decision makers trust them, make use of them, and are valid. And what with the heterogeneity among the patient population? So we have different people with different views, and how can you make that also clear? And I like the idea of being transparent about that. So having such patient preference studies, and indeed by that way offering this transparency, is very important. And we understood this as well in PREFER, and PREFER is this public-private partnership which was led by the Uppsala University. We, from the University of Leuven, were the co-leads, academic co-leads, and then Novartis was from the industry side leading this project. It's a huge project. We collaborated with many organizations, from the industry, for large and small, but also with patient organizations. And we had a great opportunity also to collaborate and have a close dialogue with EMEA, with Francesco, also with Peter, and with many others in the field, with the HTA from different national countries, in order to come up with what we call our preferred recommendations. Because we started in 2016 with actually a moment that it was really unclear what are patient preferences, how can you measure them, how can you use them. So we wanted to understand what are the needs in the field. We did plenty of interviews and talks and focus groups with people there. We identified subsequently the preference methods that could potentially be useful in the health context. So we identified these qualitative and quantitative methods, and subsequently we used them and introduced them in case studies in disease contexts. So as large teams, we did these case studies, clinical studies, and generated data that were useful. And all that work has been published. It's publicly available in plenty of scientific publications. 5 PhDs were finalized during this project. Amongst them also Rosanne Janssens is here, but also multiple presentations that we gave, YouTube videos, so just to also be, let's say, open for the lay public, that people could gain, let's say, experience and also learn from what we do. And we went through scientific advice and more specifically through the EMEA qualification procedure, which was actually also, let's say, a collaboration also with the EUnetHTA, to make sure that also the information that we were generating was also acceptable for the HTA, so for the payer reimbursement agencies. All that information informed us to write the preferred recommendations. So the preferred recommendations, which is actually this book, I will show you a bit later, it's larger than only the EMEA qualification that we did. So we produced more information along organizational guidelines, which is really stepwise plans, templates as well, training materials, webinars, which are also available. And that is all publicly available on a particular site, Zenodo. So if you want to know, look at that. Also here in this book, you can read the whole book. And the EMEA qualification opinion is also publicly available, so to see what is actually the information. It was a very, let's say, very informative interaction with the EMEA also to understand better all these aspects. So the book itself, so the recommendations, consists of different chapters, and there is a lot of information in this, so I will not dive into this in detail, but that's why key messages are important. And that's what I want to share with you here today, the key messages on some chapters where I think it's important for you, informative to know about this. So the key message on what is the value now of patient preferences can be, let's say, summarized in a way saying, okay, we in Prefer, we identified 2 use cases of patient preferences where we, after plenty of discussions, thought here patient preference studies can be of value. And where is that? Well, patient preference study to inform clinical endpoint selection. That is actually important along the drug life cycle, for instance, to inform the industry at the early sites to identify the unmet needs, but also for the regulators and also at the HTA level there, to be useful, for instance, in the relative effectiveness assessments and so forth. As well as a patient preference study on the acceptability of these benefits and risks, trade-offs, and as well the uncertainties that patients would accept in view of all these very innovative treatments that come on the market with, let's say, immature evidence, sometimes at the point of their decision. And this was what the CHMP of the EMEA also explained in the, or underscored in the EMEA qualification opinion, that these could be very valuable use cases. This is the Prefer framework, so the stepwise plan, so to say, how to conduct a patient preference study is completely written out in the book. with detailed examples and references and links and material, how to set the objectives, what is the theme, how to design the study, how to conduct the study, how to apply it in different contexts. So that's actually very important. And we know that, for instance, you always need to define a good study purpose with the intended decision, which is very specific. It's different from the very early decisions than the later decisions. A good multidisciplinary team, also including the patients from the beginning already. Timing is very important, leaving sufficient time to interact with the regulators, with the payers, with everyone actually to take also their, let's say, needs into account. Have a good study design with qualitative and quantitative parts. May differ depending on the situation and what is already available in the public domain. And the study conduct asks, this is for every study, but here, because you work with delicate and very sensitive patient populations, have a good planning activity. The applications can be very broadly, but you need to understand that such data will come along with other type of data. Some are clinical trial data, but it can also be other type of data. So that's very important to consider this. The key message on interaction with stakeholders is the following. The patients are here key. It's unthinkable to do a patient preference study without actually involving patients. That's not easy, how to involve patients. So therefore, we need to empower patients, also to include them as research partners into the study team, giving them indeed and thinking about all the conditions that have been by Christine highlighted as very important, but not always thinking that just to involve them at one particular part, but having patients along the study is very important, and think of good communication plans so that they are informed about the different steps. The regulators, also very important to have an early consultation with them so that you know that the data will in the end also be useful for them. And having awareness on these studies. Checklists, so what sponsors need to do in order to come along to the needs of the regulators and the others is very important. Academics play an important role here in order to help support, conduct scientifically robust research, which is in a way not bound to any financial or other links, where you have, let's say, a more independent, free and space to discuss things also with the public, with the private and the non-private, so the profit and the non-profit sector. And also it might offer, let's say, opportunities for us access to patients, which might sometimes be difficult for others, but as academics, in many cases, you are linked to hospitals or to other physicians, and you can talk with patients and have access to that. Because indeed, the decision makers can assume what patients think, but how good would it be that the voice of the patients could be in a very direct, transparent, uninfluenced way, go to as an additional type of information there. With respect to the methods that we identified, indeed, we have many different methods identified that are, let's say, useful in this context, in the health context, but which one to choose. That is also included, let's say, a flow chart with different characteristics that make it very, and which can then also be offered to the decision makers. This method is chosen because of this or that way. We described them, but we are also convinced that familiarity with using these methods and also the analytics that come after it is extremely important. So this slide or this information has maybe already been communicated to you. Several organizations are busy for the moment with patient experience data, patient involvement initiatives. The FDA, the European Medicines Agency, has this Regulatory Science Needs Initiative. The ICH reflection paper is on its way. KIAMS is also working on several initiatives, as you see here. And the Persons Research Community also works on different aspects. But we have indeed certain topics that we need to focus on, especially which methods to use. How in these methods do we need to describe the attributes so that they are presentable, understandable, reliable for patients to increase validity. What with changing preferences? Preferences today of patients and a particular community change over time. How to do this? How regularly do you need to do such studies in order to be up to date? And how to implement them in decision making. And indeed, familiarity, we heard it already a lot, so we need to make everyone in the field familiar with such studies, talk about them, not only talking, but also doing them and offering data and having a case there where they are used. And I'm happy that we heard about such case also today, but it could be more increase. So in this way, raising awareness, having guidances there for the people in the field that conduct them, but also need them for assessment and education. That's maybe where we at the university can take a role to educate students, young regulators, or who else that need to use them, decision makers, in order to use unbiased methodological approaches for measuring them. And so I think this is what we need to do, and time is now, I think, there to do this. I'm very happy having all these experts here together to bring this field forward. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Isabelle. So that really brings us to sort of already a pre-break, but which might be nice for getting a little bit of the audience to understand who of you has done a patient preference study or read about a patient preference study? 1, 2, 3, 6, 8, 8-ish, something like that. So actually, what we were talking of the whole time is actually how we want to present this also to patients. And Hans, Hillege, and Douwe and Sonia will later on really make you do such a case. But good is to realize is that what Isabelle actually very nicely framed is that you have these pictures of a benefit of a drug having a effect and the other one having some, the same drug having some adverse effects. And also the picture that Francesco showed with the triangle with just 3 effects, benefit and 2 harms, short term, a bit of longer term, and you have to make choices between that. Clearly, the real world is a bit different again, where drugs have multiple effects and you really have to balance with that. And so what often can be done, and you must imagine, is that you use pictures and you may make it more complex, is where people have to make choices between hypothetical scenarios. So you get a drug presented with multiple effects, and on one hand, on the other hand, and you have to make choices between that. And by repeating this and playing a little bit with the choices you have to make and the drug effects there are, you really start understanding what people do and what is important to them. Keep that in your mind, because that will be important if you go into the discussion further on. But what I liked about Stan and also Cristina is that you clearly do not have to limit it to that effect of the end where you have the drug effects already. You really want also to understand what people think is relevant. What do I want from the drug? And many of us, I'm coming from mostly diabetes and cardiometabolic diseases, and it's easy. I want to live longer. Okay, that takes a little bit long and large trials to see, so perhaps there are other things. So I'm looking at benefits also of the drug. But what do you like there? An MI, myocardial infarction, that is a good thing. That we can measure, we know exactly how to do that. We have lots of things and boxes to tick. Feel very confident if that has been done. Something else, still a little stroke, and with that, also something that is important to prevent. But clearly, once you become in a larger field, in the field where you also want to understand what the patient does, and you look at the liver, and I didn't take any liver outcomes because I'm much less familiar there, but clearly itch sounds a bit different than a liver transplantation. Nevertheless, these are important effects you're looking at if you have a patient with severe liver disease and you want to see what does it do. Again, looking at just the liver transplant, it will take you very long and probably too large studies to really get those outcomes. So we start playing with that. And then it's obviously if you have 2 liver transplants prevented in the one arm, but many people not having itch during the day or during the night may be something that you want to weigh again. And these are things where we can really get more and should get more that patient perspective on. So I think that's a little bit the context where we're playing with. And now I stopped talking because you wanted to go to the coffee, but I wanted you to trigger you a little bit on, okay, what are we actually really talking about? And I think we've got some really nice views on where people have worked on it, where you can apply to it in the whole drug life cycle, but also really talk at lunch or at break, not just about the nice weather that you're not going to see because you're inside, but also about what the patient really wants us to develop drugs for. So off you go, back at 1600.
Good afternoon, welcome back again. I think it's on, right? Okay, thank you. So welcome back after the break. I hope you had nice conversations, but most of all, I hope you have a lot of questions for the speakers before the break. So that's why we invited them for a panel of about 40 to 45 minutes. So you can ask all questions that you have on your mind. We also have the possibility for those who are with us through the live stream to ask your questions. So put your questions in the chat box and they will come to me on the screen and hopefully we can address them as well. My name is, I will not forget to introduce me, Peter. My name is Sjaak Bot. I am with Peter and with Marion Posmoy, the co-chair of the Regulatory Science Network in the Netherlands. So together we represent the partners of RSNN, that is industry, academia, and of course the regulators. We will have a panel, we do have a panel representing all of these pillars, plus of course the patients, because today is all about the patients. So we have two speakers who will really focus on the patients. Well, actually all of our speakers will do so. The panel is intended to be really interactive. I do have backup questions. As a good panel leader, I always have a question to prevent that there is complete silence, but I really would love to have you asking the questions. So with that, I would like to start the discussion. We will first start with the two people that haven't been speaking so far yet, and that is Susan Batty and Hans Hillege. They will introduce themselves at first, and then we take the panel active. So Susan, maybe you can start.
Yes, thank you so much, Sjaak. So my name is Susan Batty. I work for Merck Healthcare. I am based in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. And I'm very happy to have been invited to this RSNN conference workshop today. I am part of Global Regulatory Affairs. I work in our Global Regulatory and Scientific Policy Group. I am also co-chairing the Clinical Research Expert Group at EFPIA, which is the industry association, and I co-chair a new patient engagement group at EFPIA as well. It's a topic I'm very, very passionate about, and where I see a real opportunity for us to work collaboratively to make sure that the patient voice is far better embedded in drug development than it has been to date. So that's me.
Thank you. And then we have Hans on the panel, Hans Hillege.
Thank you very much. My name is Hans Hillege. I'm the Dutch representative in the CHMP. I do have a medical background, the professor in cardiology at the University Medical Center. I think during my work as a regulator, I got interest. The interest rates increased substantially with how to move over to a more transparent benefit-risk discussion. So in this context, also one important part of this is the preference solicitation. So I'm interested in the preference solicitation from a regulatory point of view, but also how to implement it, let's say, preference of patients in our decision making. And I'm also participating in the benefits working group from the CHMP.
Thank you very much. Okay, you know all the other speakers, so it's now time for you to raise questions. So who wants to go first? in the back. Maybe you can mention your name, affiliation, and do we have mics in the room?
Maybe just one, so can I...
So I
run around.
I hope you have a question for Stan or for Francesco.
Thank you. So my name is Vera Nies. I'm a program manager at Hillege, and I'm involved with patient engagement in the Radar AD project. And there, I think it's going really well. But I really like to hear from you if you have other ideas and suggestions on how to convince investigators and researchers to at least think about patient engagement, how to involve them in the research, and to think about how it's done in a meaningful way. That's question one. I have two. And the other one is a question to Stan. I'm really curious to hear how your peers react when you share your experiences with involving patients in your research.
And the first question was to whom?
To the whole group. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone wants to reply to the question? How can we stimulate basically more patient engagement? Right.
You have the microphone yourself. It's only Francesco.
Yes. Okay. No. Thanks a lot for this question. This, I think, very important question. In order to stimulate researchers to collaborate and work with patients, I think it's important to also to explain it and also to come up with good, let's say, examples where it happened and where really the outcome was so fruitful for that. So that's what we did. We collaborate with patients and try to share it also as much as possible in the broader field, also with the researchers. And communicate with them as well. Also, potentially the patient organizations themselves can spread the news that actually this is a very interactive and fruitful thing. Not only the researchers, but I think indeed at the educational institutions, universities, there should be more attention on when studies are set up and funded, that these are, let's say, set up and designed in collaboration with patients, and that can also, let's say, push researchers into that direction, I think.
Anyone else?
I think I can step in also. It's more or less an extension of what you said. I think to gain interest, at least from a physician, is to allocate problems in which at least this part of preference elicitation should be made an important point. And I agree with you that patience is an important aspect as it is, but just to give you an example, more or less to gain interest in physicians, I was looking for instance, settings in which teams meetings were organized instead, where different disciplines were together to finalize or to conclude about a certain type of clinical trajectory to be stepped. For instance, we have a team in our hospital which is involved in implementing left ventricular assistance devices, and there's a strong patient voice, but also different disciplines are connected. And just asking how you comes up with a discussion and a final conclusion gains at least interest also, and then you move slightly to shared decision making, but at least preference is an important aspect. And so just that's one example, I think.
Thank you. And the second question was for Stan.
Yeah, maybe we can also answer the first question first. So I think from an academic perspective, our currency can also be publication, and also people are also always interested in funding. So there are more and more journals, and the British Medical Journal is another example, that have a sort of special parts where you can have co-publication with academia and patient representatives or patients directly. So that's sort of interesting for academia. Also funding-wise, for instance, the Heart Foundation has a program where they ask for feedback from a certain population, including a lot of patients, on how to improve your grants. And finally, I think connecting to, like we did, with agencies, either focusing more on researchers or on patients that, for instance, exist for 5 or 10 or 50 years, and to sort of actively recruit them. Did you think about having a patient contribution in your jubileum? Might also be an option. So yeah, those are more of those 3 very practical strategies. Then my other question is, how did my peers respond when we organized this? Yeah, there were sort of two responses. One, where initially mostly the clinicians were a bit hesitant because, well, they say, I see patients every day, so why would I organize another event? That was before we actually organized it, so afterwards I did get some positive feedback. And for the non-clinicians, so the people like me work in the lab and don't see patients, they were generally quite enthusiastic, and I think it's also for them more of an opportunity to focus their research more. So afterwards it was liked by both, but in the beginning there seems to be sort of two flavors in it.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, my name is Mara Tigea. I will start as a postdoc in the Center for Cell and Gene Therapy in the LUMC from the 1st of November. This is actually my first introduction with the regulatory network affairs. I've been trained as a clinician. So as a clinician, the subject of patient participation is very close to my heart. And I'm very happy to learn that it's as much relevant for you as it is for me. And my question is actually for Cristina. It's lovely to see that you, within the breast cancer network, that you've identified several types of patients with different needs. In my experience as a clinician, there is also a type of patient that actually is more, how do you say it, is less inclined to participate in the shared decision-making, and it's actually more leaning towards the clinician making all the decisions in a traditional paternalistic view. And in my experience, those are usually also the more introverted patients that are less inclined to participate in these kind of initiatives. So my question to you is, how do you do you try to also involve these people to make sure that their needs are also represented within the different types of patients that you identified, and how do you do this? And for the other people, are you aware that that particular patient is most likely least represented in all the patient communications that you normally would have, because they won't come to these kind of events?
Thank you for the question, very good question. Well, that's one of the things we try to elaborate through our volunteers. We have 200 volunteers, different types of volunteers, and we always search what kind of person do you need for what kind of question, but also what competences does one have. And we don't always want runner-ups, like you said, but also people who can analyze things or who are a bit more introvert. So in the selection process, that's an important aspect, and we take it into account. And our experience is that if we look at our patient advocacy group, there are 20, like I said, more or less, and they're really different because it's the topic that interests them and the way they are approached, and they can participate, being who they are, that makes it more valuable. So it's in the matching is an important factor, but what you say is really important. In the 4 types of patients that I showed, one of them is more the introvert type of patients, but also she, in this case, wants to have shared decision making, but on a different way. It isn't so that she solely says, well, you're the healthcare, so you can make all the decisions. No, she relies more on experience of the healthcare, but finally also wants to make it her own decision. So it's a different type of communication that you need.
Okay. I think indeed, and that's absolutely a very important question, that not all patients want to be involved in the same way in different studies and in different, let's say, research projects. So that we need to be open for that and be very clear in front, or at the front, at the beginning, about this. That's the same also in patient preference research studies. There as well, we identified how patients can be involved and when. We did this already, and we had also a lot of learnings there. But yeah, it's very important to be open there as well, indeed. And it can go via patient organizations. we have physicians that have sometimes close contact with patients that potentially are not linked to patient organizations or can be linked afterwards. But I mean, just to open up the, let's say, the group of patients that can be involved in such studies might be having, let's say, a diverse way of involving them via patient organizations, via clinicians, and so forth. Yeah.
One addition in that, a group that's really difficult to reach is people who are with low social economic status or illiterate. And that's also for a patient organization like ours, it's also difficult to reach out to them. So that what it requires is a lot of more and different kind of thinking. How can we reach them? How can we reach out to them? How can we include them and make them part of our world? And I think that's for next year for us. It's something we're going to work on, because we see that I can sit here, but I don't represent the whole group. I realize that there are a specific group of people that are not in our fellow sufferers.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm at Torquay. I work with the Medicines Evaluation Board. So it's actually a follow-up question on the previous question. It's what's your shared experience exactly on that differences or heterogeneity in different ethnicities and cultures? And because that's also a very multicultural society we live in, with different people and having different attitudes, sometimes stigmatization of certain diseases, especially in oncology perhaps, and being quiet about it. So what's your experience with those patients and groups and getting their involvement? And it's a broad question to all panelists, actually.
Shall I start first? It's difficult. It's like what you say. It's we have within our volunteers group, we have, I think, 4 or 5 women with different cultural backgrounds, and so we use them to how do you say it? Spiegelen. Mirror a lot with them to see how we can enable ourselves. How can we get a better interaction with the other groups? There are in the Netherlands. There are different groups that have. You have Mama Rosa. That's a well-known group in the Amsterdam and the Hague that really work with multicultural women, and we try to engage with them so we can reach through them different types of other women. But it's it's a situation where they also say you don't have to, social media doesn't work well, you have to go out, you have to go on the street, you have to talk to them, you have to be able to talk their language, you have to also a different way of communication. I talked about the videos we made, and that's 20 videos we made about the breast cancer treatment, the whole treatment, and we made them with especially for them, because we realized we can make a lot of information folders, they don't read them. But a video is something they can relate a lot better to. So it's a different kind of thinking and approach. It takes more time, more effort.
Anyone else want to react to the cultural?
Yeah, I just want to touch upon this, because that's also the difficulty, I think, for the regulator. What is the patient voice? Let's say there is such a spectrum of preferences across a population of patients, let's say, and that if we need to incorporate this type of information in our decision making, let's say we have to deal with 27 countries and 27 CGP members and 27 opinions. So we know what the heterogeneity is in thinking, but in patients it's even far more larger. And that's one of our main questions. What should we include, and what type of patients we should include, because that will also have the consequences, and that we're struggling with it. Honestly, we are struggling with it.
Yeah, maybe Peter? Yeah, and I'll keep you in mind.
Thank you. I mean, it's a phenomenally interesting question, and I mean, we talk about preferences, but what's behind preferences? And then, I'm not a psychologist, but what they tell us is that you have core values, and these core values depend on many things, including, you know, the environment, the ethnicity, the culture, and so on. And perhaps somebody one day will be able to understand this. I don't think anybody does at the moment. But our task is easier in the sense that we don't necessarily have to map out the preferences of the entire market, so to speak, in order to know whether a drug is useful or not, at least for someone. And it shouldn't stop us. The fact that we're not universally representative of each and every patient preference, it shouldn't stop us in trying to do that. Often we hear this as a criticism. We would work with a patient organization, say, can you run a survey for us? And they will run it. But these are people who have time to sit at the computer an hour an hour, 15 minutes, and answer questions. And so this is a highly selected population. But that doesn't mean these patients are not real. And often that's a question that is good enough for us. And on the proper generalizability, I think, Peter, we are rather relaxed as regulators. If we start being serious about it, let's start from clinical trials. How formally generalizable are the results of those clinical trials? What do we do in terms of exploratory analysis to whatever, adjust the results by the real population? We never do that. Before we heard about the importance of putting in the label stuff. Now imagine if we started to modify the results of the trials by what they would likely be in the real target population. We should be doing that. So, no, I think we focus on the bigger picture, and in that, even if we're not complete, I think it's good enough. But it's a phenomenally interesting question that we should slowly pursue and become more formal about.
There's someone in your panel who wants to say.
You want to?
I just want to follow up on that, actually. Certainly, this is one of the questions that within industry we are very interested in getting an answer to. How will the regulators view the representativeness of studies on patient preferences? Because in the US, they are busy designing some guidance on what they're going to expect. It's quite extensive. So it would be very, very interesting for us to know in which direction EMEA is going here. Really one of the key asks from industry is what are you expecting there? So it would be great if we could see some progress.
Still want to respond, Francesco?
I look forward to having this conversation, and I think the whole idea about patient preferences is that you focus on the individual. So the fact that we need to sample the whole population to get some sort of an average to see whether on average people would like the drug, that isn't very useful. That isn't very different from what we're doing now. So I'm welcoming this conversation, but on our panel we have
No, I think what you're stating, that's correct. Let's see. From a regulatory point of view, it's for me more that it gives more or less the boundaries of thinking. Let's say at the end you will come up from a regulator as an overall benefit-risk balance. That could be positive. But if you will implement in this positive decision different type of patient preferences, is the decision still positive? Or if you do have a negative position, will the position change? And I think that's important also from let's say from a regulatory point of view, that at least to be connected to the outside world in your own decision making. So I don't think that factual, the point estimates or something, or the certain type of weight, it's more or less the boundaries that we are talking about, and how we should, and important I think also in this context, but we can discuss that also later probably, is how to bridge this. Is a patient-reported outcome, how is it connected to the decision making as a regulator or as a clinician? Because these are differences, and that's also that I think that's part of the discussion. Thank you.
I like the way where you talked about it. It's going towards the boundaries, because Sonia Roldan, our PhD student, Hans, has done this very nice paper actually, where she really saw that how patients value drug effects of diabetes drugs really changes if you look in a Turkish population versus a Dutch population. So I think it's really giving you these boundaries. You will have to come back, Francesco, when we talk about trials and generalizability at another time.
Yeah, my question is actually connected to that. I'm Larissa Delanoy. I'm a patient advocate. I worked with Stan on that paper. I was part of a multi-stakeholder meeting at the EMEA where we discussed a reflection paper on PSA and PBC, and I think another indication. And actually thinking about that, so maybe it's a question for the prefer, or it's a question for Francesco, I don't know. What's the thinking about it? If you are, we were there as representatives of patient organizations, and we were giving our views. Of course, it was not a preference study that we based ourselves on. We did have, how do you say that? So we asked a lot of patients. We had a database on that. We brought the data. A survey, thank you. So is there a different thinking about the mechanism when you are in the process of developing a guidance to, at that very start, already get that patient preference in place, so that at the end, of course, you have the decision making and you can have additional studies. But I was just thinking, okay, what are the thoughts on that at this stage?
Isabelle? Yeah.
Yes, I think it's important that the input of the patients is, let's say, clearly documented and also be used in the efforts of the agency and other decision makers to be transparent about the decisions. So you did a survey or whatever, you offered some data. We in Prefer, we did a lot of patient preference studies. I think that data is very valuable to communicate to the different decision makers, to the EMEA, but also to the payers and to physicians, for them to use in their decisions. And I can imagine for EMEA, for instance, they need to take decisions Europe-wide. It's difficult to handle with this diversity and heterogeneity of all these patients, but at least they take a decision, they look at the patient preference data, for instance, they take the decision. It does not need per definition to change or not. There is a decision, they have to also look at the data, and they are confident, or let's say haven't taken a particular, let's say, rationale, why not yes or no, take into account that preference data, but also publish that data so that actually everyone is aware of the fact that, for instance, EMEA has looked at least at this. The situation can be different at the national level. Because suppose that, for instance, in Romania or whatever, patients are completely reluctant for a particular type of whatever side effect or yeah, and there the payer needs to allow or not allow or make decisions on market access. Yeah, that information potentially even from the same patient preference study can have a completely different, let's say, outcome at the payer level than at the EMEA level. But just being transparent about this, publish the outcome, is, let's say, for the whole community, not to, let's say, lose resources, but to increase transparency. And not to make decisions more difficult, but just to make decisions more transparent. I think that's important. And we developed the Prefer framework because there is a need to have this robust, let's say, methodologically track of using this method and these criteria and so forth, to have a structured approach. Also for the decision makers to use this as a checklist. But I'm not saying, but it can be that other types of patient engagement and patient input and so forth can be used by the regulators. But we just did this for patient preference studies. That's what I'm thinking.
Susan?
Yeah, I can only second what Isabelle said, that it is really important, in my view, that the use of this data in the decision making about a product is transparent. It's really important Personally, I think for patients, it's important to see that there was patient input. It's also important for us in industry because only then can you see, will companies learn from each other about how to use this input. As long as that's a black box, unfortunately, people may be a little cautious about going down that road because they just don't know what's going to come out at the end of it. And so I think it would be generally helpful all round. It would be nice if we could have some guidance, a little bit of structure there, a place where that information can be put in an EPAR, maybe in the product information, would be extremely helpful for us, really. Thank you.
You want to comment or not? Well,
just to add to the point of the guidelines, I think in the past we have not been nearly as systematic as you wished us to be. And there's a new system now where instead of writing the guidelines, let's say, in-house, and then relying on a public consultation mechanism to get all the input, we're going to try and appoint expert groups to write the guideline, and by all means including patient input, and then that will be at least having the relevant expertise from the start. Now, we are guilty as everybody else of not involving patients enough, and although there is a natural evolution of the system, there are still places where we can hugely improve, and this is one of them. So thanks for focusing our attention also on guidelines.
Thank you. We do have a question from the live stream, and then I'll come back to you. The question is for Susan. I'll read it. Susan, what is, in your opinion, the added value from an industry perspective for increased integration of patient experience data in regulatory decision making, and what is needed to maximize the use of patient experience data? You alluded already, but maybe the last sentence, what is needed to maximize the use of?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think to maximize the use of patient experience data, industry really, as I said, needs to know what's going to happen to it. Yeah, that's what you get asked if you're working in a drug development team and you go to them and you start talking about, can we include a patient-reported outcome here as a secondary endpoint? Can we include a patient preference study here? Then you get the question back, so, well, if we do that, what's going to happen to that data? And unless we can give examples and say, well, you know what's going to happen to it because it's written here in the guidance, we know that it's going to be here in the EPAR, it might get into the product information if it's relevant enough. And if there is very little in the way of examples out there, then teams are just hesitant. They're under a huge amount of time pressure. And I think in order to increase the use of, industry obtaining data, the use of that data in regulatory decision making, we need to have clarity about what's going to happen to it. That's my main thing that we need. And I think, a little bit more structure would be extremely helpful there.
Susan, can I challenge you on that? Because it's almost as if the regulators were the only beneficiaries of those data, and that is not the case. I think everyone who has gone through regulatory process knows that you submit data for an indication, and then there is all sorts of discussions about, it's too big, and here not every benefits, and the subgroup, and maybe sometimes a refusal, and so on. And in order to have that conversation with regulators nowadays, you have opinions, assumptions, saying, the drug is amazing, and we say, no, actually not. And to give that type of conversation, some type of scientific rigor, as an industry, why don't you recognize that, let's say, patient preference studies will provide you, a theoretical framework for making all sorts of statements that then regulators will, might contest, but on a scientific basis rather than on an opinion basis. Would that not make your decisions much more predictable?
I am totally with you that we should be doing a lot more in terms of patient preference studies and patient-reported outcomes in our studies, but it's trying to get those messages down to the teams in the companies who are actually doing the development that at the moment is still, honestly, quite tricky. And I'm talking about my own experience, but also colleagues that I've talked to have given me similar feedback. I think what will be very helpful are things like the multi-stakeholder workshop that is obviously happening in a couple of weeks at EMEA. I think we need to have more of those conversations between all the stakeholders to elevate the importance of this topic. I think that's, and that it's seen that at the level of the regulators, this is important, that this data is submitted by companies, that it is going to be evaluated, and that it is really something that we ought to do together. So I think that's the first step, and I really would like to see that carried forward in future. So not just this one workshop, but moving forward to have a lot more interaction between the stakeholders to find platforms where we can develop recommendations here. Moving forward, that would be very, very helpful indeed.
Can I have a follow-up question to Stan? In your very early phase research, would you also welcome that point of view that even in your basic research you would understand what the patient think is important? You talked about itch versus liver enzymes. Well, not sure how you measure that in an early phase, but would you make a plea for thinking differently about that?
Definitely yes. Because typically the timelines are also quite long in preclinical research. So to figure out what's going on, what provides a molecular target, you can easily work on a topic for 10 years. Yeah. If this topic is less relevant for patients than another topic, yeah, I think you're essentially wasting your academic life. So I think many scientists have quite a broad interest. So I think getting a bit of input on what is more important to patients and others can help. Yeah, it's not on a day-to-day basis, but more on a strategic level. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We go there.
My name is Pauline Evers. I'm working for the Dutch Cancer Patient Organization, so I'm a patient advocate. I have a zillion questions, so I have very much difficulty to make order in my mind to see what I should ask first. First, I would like to make a remark, because if you talk about patient preferences, Cristina and myself were just discussing over the coffee break and trying to answer the question from Peter in the beginning about the cholesterol-lowering agents. And you asked the audience, what would you do as a regulator, approve this or not? This is a symposium about patient preference. The question should have been to the entire audience, you can be such a patient tomorrow. Actually, most of you would probably know patients with high cholesterol levels. What would you, as a patient, do? And Cristina said, I would take the drug. And I said, no, of course not. I would never take the drug because of all those muscle pain, etc. So that shows already how difficult patient preference actually is, because if you ask the same question to the same patient, one would say yes and the other would say no. Francesco just mentioned that patient preference is about the individual patient. Then my question would be, how are we ever going to value this in the regulatory framework? I'm also one of the 3 patient representatives in the Orphan Medicinal Product Committee at the EMEA already for over 12 years. So I have also this regulatory ideas about and the difficulties we encounter. So you say, well, let's go, it's about the individual patient, but how can you incorporate the value for the individual patient in regulatory decision making? And then the other end of the spectrum is like what we do with PREFER. We do qualification of patient preference instruments. My goodness, if we have to go down that way, it will take 50 years before we are going to start patient preference studies, because if we have to validate each and every separate patient preference instrument for the hundreds or thousands of diseases we have and the numerous amount of products we are going to approve, where are we going to start? So that is actually a big split in the two ends of the spectrum. And I don't see that we are going to get a quick answer to that. So I think it's still quite difficult how we are going to do. And I think patient organizations are more and more able to collect data from their own members and to also bring those forward in regulatory processes. But then exactly like what you were saying from the industry side, patients should know what they can bring to the table. Because if I come to the EMA with a simple survey I have done, EMA would say, well, this is not really sound science, so we are going to neglect it. So how can we actually, what would be the system to collect the data without having tough validation procedures, etc.? So those were a couple of my remarks.
Thank you. Well, a lot of questions, and it shows that we are still early in developing the framework for patient preferences. Not sure if someone wants to react to that. I mean, it's not a question, it's just observations, like. And you said you have a zillion questions, and I think you only mentioned 3 or 4, so... but yeah, Stan, please.
Yeah. I was intrigued by your comments about the choice between 2 types of a drug, taking a drug, yes or no. But that would essentially mean that you can only make such a choice as a patient if the drug is already approved and available to you, right? So that would be patient participation at a stage which is probably rather beyond this regulatory. So that would be just allow everything. So that is maybe that's my perspective on this comment. So that would say you have to not put too much restrictions in an early phase. But I'm not sure how you see this.
Okay, we have Isabelle to comment on the remarks, and then we have a question from the live stream.
Yeah. No, I think indeed, in terms of the need for validation of these patient preference studies all the time, when there is a new patient preference study opportunity, I think indeed we did in PREFER a lot of work in qualifying this framework to conduct patient preference studies. And we did this also in very close dialogue with the EMA. And that work is now done and is now, let's say, spoken through with the EMA in depth. So I think we need to make use of that particular step. It's not that the EMA, for instance, requested as a mandatory subsequent step that for every patient preference study there needed to be a validation on all these studies again and again in all these different disease areas. I think that is potentially a little bit of a misunderstanding. I think that the point is that making use of this qualified framework to conduct patient preference studies in different disease areas and publishing the results and discussing about this and actually become more familiar with all these results, also in a discussion with the EMA, may move the field already further and does not take indeed 10 extra years per disease area before, for instance, the EMA might look at this data. I think at this point, and maybe Francesco and Hans, you could comment on that, but that was actually the ultimate aim of having the qualification, that we would speed up the use of that framework in the different disease areas, and that dogs can... And indeed, about the individual patient, indeed, these studies may indeed be used to reveal the individual patient preference studies, but in the end, we have the collective, the quantitative data on all these patient preference studies, which can be looked at on a more, let's say, broader level in order to inform the decisions. Yeah. But Francesco, or you could do.
Thank you.
I think, to be honest, from let's say the strategy of an EMEA and also from the IMI is to go more or less bottom up. We build up the infrastructure and then we go up. So I think you can also think in different ways. Just a practical example. A company is developing a product for alopecia. That's hair loss. And the product is really, it is effective, but it does have a huge side effect profile. If you will submit this type of information to a regulator who is not fully aware about, let's say, the burden of the patient about this type of disease, he will become negative, purely based on the side effect profile of the drug. And in this context, I think that a company should recognize this. And they should start up at an early discussion. We understand the difficulties, but what type of information do you need and on what level, on what scientific level, to get at least this type of information, how important the alopecia for the patient is. And I think in this context, it makes life easier also to adapt also for regulators. Yeah. But it's more or less changing the scene a little bit. Thank you.
Early engagement. Thank you. So we do have, looking at the time, we have to close this discussion. There's one question on the live stream, and that brings us back to the patients, which is a nice closing the loop. So back to you, Cristina, and after your answer, we will close this session.
Yeah.
And I will read it. But, Cristina, great to hear the efforts of the Dutch Breast Cancer Society to incorporate patient preferences in various studies. Are the outcomes of these studies communicated to the general public and the patients? And if so, and when, during the study, after the study, and or after publication?
I was going to make a joke. I was going to say, no, we never publish anything. But
that's a short answer.
It's a short answer. But the answer is in the question, yes, we do. And we do it during the study, after the study, and or after publication. What we usually do is with the researcher, we look at what phase we can bring out what information about the study. And that differs a little bit depending on the study, but we do it through our organization, through the researcher, and at the end also through all the official channels.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I think with this patient-centric closing answer, I would like to finalize this session, close it. Thank you, all the panel, please applause. And after the next sessions, which will be introduced by Peter, you will have sufficient opportunity to interact with the panelists during the drinks. Now back to Peter.
All right. Okay, I think that was really interesting, and I hope we will have a bit of time also afterwards to discuss a little bit more on certain aspects of patient preference studies. But what we're now going to do is really an exercise, and I'm really happy to introduce my colleagues, Douwe Postmus, Hans Hillege, who was already on the podium, but especially also Sonia Roldan Muñoz, who is our PhD student really working on patient preferences. And what they're going to do is really work on you with a benefit-risk weighting exercise. And as Pauline really pointed out, it can be perceived from different views or in different roles. But I leave it happily up to my Groninger colleagues to do that. Who's starting? Hans?
I think we do have a number of slides to set up the scene. At least yeah, it's fine for me. So we discussed it a lot today, patient preferences, and me as a regulator, I think it's very important and useful information because it's pivotal to gain up to a final decision. But like I said before, we are struggling how to implement it in our decision making. And we had an approach that was more or less, I think Francesco was all at the early stages, was involved in this, that an aspect that you can use the impact of patient preferences in your decision making is using more a quantitative approach. And the quantitative approach will, as a consequence, will be that the decisions we are making will become more transparent. And I have to say, this is a journey from now, Francesco, 12 years, 30 years, probably in this direction. And we're gaining step by step, sometimes a step forward, sometimes 2 steps backward, etc., etc. It's probably an aspect that we are not used to, but I will give you some explanation, and I think in this context that you will probably, hopefully you will recognize how important this information could be if you will extract this type of information. It could be from the regulator, it could also be from the patient, and how to interact this type of information. And it even is, I think it's important in different type of stakeholder settings, like payers or physicians, or etc., etc. So it starts more or less with the legal framework. The legal framework was at first focused on efficacy, and that was the main aspect of assessment of new pharmaceuticals to demonstrate efficacy of the drug. And based on experience, it was extended to safety. So it should at least all be, the drug should be efficacious, but at least we think that the advantages must outweigh the potential risk. And then we comes up with the final decision that is, let's say, it's also asked not only from regulator, but it's also asked for every stakeholder. What is the overall perspective, the overall balance, the overall risk balance of a certain type of medical intervention? So, and this is more or less the difficulties we have, because we are now dealing with 2 different types of roads. You're going for the left, you go for efficacy. You go to the right, you go for safety. But you should bring them together. And that's an activity that we are now trying at least to make the CGP familiar with for numerous years, with all its difficulties. And this is more or less a simplistic concept from the difficulties we are dealing. This is a typical drug. It has been developed for Alzheimer's disease. And you have to make a decision about certain type of variables of attributes. And we have made it not so complicated this time. We do have only one favorable effect of this drug. And this favorable effect is more or less formulated in terms of disease progression. And what, as a regulator, data will be submitted, and in the data this will be submitted in the sense that the company would try to at least to make transparent what will the gain of disease progression. And they comes up with data from 5.7 years for the active treatment, so the index treatment, with compared to 4 years for treatment B, which is the control treatment. So there is a gain of 1.7 year. But we do have side effects, and side effects is a part of the benefit-risk balance. So we do have the moderate side effect, and that is, for instance, patients with an ARIA event, or do we have severe side effects, patients with the brain microhemorrhage. And Sonia will more explain into detail. And also, these aspects will have the contribution in the overall benefit-risk balance. And now we're moving to the benefit-risk balance. And now we are thinking quantitatively. And what you can see is that the benefit balance does have a favorable contribution. And the favorable contribution is more or less the difference we will see between the 2 products, yeah? With more or less their point estimate. And then there is this term weight included. And weight is nothing more than a description about the importance we contribute to this effect. Yeah? And the weight is personal. That's something every individual does contribute his own weight. But we need, at least in this context, we need to extract in a reasonable way this weight assessment. Because, and the other point of the balance are the unfavorable effects. And every unfavorable effect is contributed with a certain level of difference. The effect itself, the prominence we call it, let's say a myocardial infarction, the interpretation of a myocardial infarction for patients is completely different as high cholesterol, for instance. back to the cardiovascular field. So these two components, the favorable and unfavorable effects, should bring together, and there will be an equation. So, and the only possibility to create this type of equation is questioning. Questioning about preferences. Questioning about the maximal acceptable risk if you want to change one of the contributes with the other. And using this type of information, this weight assessment at the end, and that will demonstrate it later on in this session, you can bring these different components to each other, to a quantitative benefit balance. And that's also the reason I think that is important, what I mentioned before, that you should at least know what are the boundaries of this weight assessment across individuals. Because for one individual, you can conclude to a positive benefit risk, where if in the case will you use different weights in this type of equation, the benefit risk could be negative. And that's something more or less to set up the scene with the assessment that will be done now. Sonia?
Hello. Yeah, so what we wanted to present today is an interactive case study in Alzheimer's disease. And for that, what I will do is present a bit of the clinical context and the target population for what would be a new treatment. Then we will go to the design of a very simple preference study, and we will elicit your preferences of the people here and online for this specific treatment that we will present. After that, we will analyze this information together, and for the last part, for the application or the applicability of it, that we will come here and present how this information could be used in the benefit-risk balance assessment. So first, the clinical context. Alzheimer's disease is the main cause of dementia, and it affects more than 50 million people worldwide. Traditional treatments are based in a combination of pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical options that try to mitigate the cognition decline and alleviate the symptoms. But these treatments do not modify the progression of the disease. It's the new potential treatments that are now under development that will modify that progression of the disease. The target population for these treatments are people living with mild cognitive impairment. And for the purpose of this exercise, we explain the progression of Alzheimer's disease in 3 stages. We start by the initial forgetfulness, where people will have problems remembering specific episodes, such as names or birthdays. They will have challenges with learning new information, and they might need help with complex tasks. When the disease progresses to a mild to moderate dementia, they not only forget birthdays or names, but they struggle to find words to follow conversations. They will require full assistance with complex tasks, such as their finances, and it will not be longer safe to stay alone or travel by themselves. This will keep progressing to the severe stage, where they will not be able to follow conversations, and they will lose the ability to perform simple tasks, such as dressing or maintain their hygiene. So what we will do now is designing a very simple preference study in which we will have a treatment, and this treatment, as we mentioned, will have some therapeutic benefits and some side effects. These side effects can be moderate or can be severe. And for everyone to know or start at the same point, what we will do is defining very clearly these concepts. So we start by the therapeutic benefits. This will be defined as the number of years until more care and support is needed. It is expressed on average, and is it how long it takes on average for people on the treatment to progress to the next stage of the disease. And the range can go from 4 to 6 years. When we define the moderate side effects, is the number of people who experience periods of discomfort, is expressed in percentage, and is defined as discomfort that affect their ability to perform daily activities. We specify that they will not need medical assistance, but it will happen several times during the use of the drug, and it can be caused because of dizziness, nausea, diarrhea, or headache. And finally, we have the severe side effects, and this is the number of people who experience a side effect that could result in long-term or permanent disability. We express it again as a percentage, and in this case, we give a specific example that could be paralysis in half of the body or loss of speech caused by a non-fatal stroke. And the range here can go from 10% to 65%. So having this information in mind, what we want to do now is elicit your preferences. So I would like to imagine everyone here in the room, also online, to imagine to be a person that has recently been diagnosed with cognitive impairment. We are all in the initial forgetfulness stage, so we are having some problems to remember dates, birthdays, and names. We have challenges with learning new information and with complex tasks. And we would like to know, well, in the normal progression of the disease, our cognitive impairment will lead us to the mild to moderate dementia. So what I would like to ask you is, what are the maximum risks that you would be willing to accept to delay for 2 years the progression of the disease from the initial forgetfulness to the next stage? To put it a bit clearer for everyone, we have created 2 tables. They display the same information, they only vary in the side effects. So the first table has the therapeutic benefits, as I just defined, and treatment A has 4 years of benefits, and treatment B has 6 years. So we have 2 years delay in the progression of the disease. For the moderate side effect, treatment A has a 30% risk of it, and what we want to know is the risk you would accept for treatment B. And the table below shows the same information, but instead of the moderate side effect, we have the severe side effects. So I would like to ask you to take your telephones and scan these QR codes. I hope it's possible, and if not, please type the website that is next to it. Yes, we can do that later. I think Douwe will also elaborate a bit more on that, but if not, we can have some questions later. Okay, yeah. So you have to scroll a bit up and down to see all the options, and when you choose the option, then you find next on top, but you might need to scroll to see that. Yeah, you are already in the initial forgetfulness. I will wait half a minute because 12 people are still responding, and then we will analyze the responses together. It's just the people who are completing it, not the results yet. Well, I can just start, and maybe this changes a bit with the last people responding. Okay, so this is the distribution of the results of the survey. We see that the majority of people would accept up to 45% risk of moderate side effects in order to delay the progression of the disease, and this is followed by 30% of people that would accept 55% of it. If we go to the... No, sorry, the largest group, sorry, you are right. Well, in total, it's 60% of people, so it's still the majority that would accept up to 55%. But yeah, it is not the majority, and I have to say that it's quite homogeneous compared to other studies that we have performed. But let's see how it is for the severe side effects. Well, it's very different. Here, the majority of people would not accept more than 15% risk of severe side effects, but still, well, about 40% of people would accept more than 50% risk, which, of course, from a regulatory perspective, 15% is already really high, but we see from patients' perspective, it seems still acceptable. You are actually not the first group of people performing this survey. Well, this is a simplified version of an actual preference study we performed with people in the UK. And this is the distribution for the moderate side effect that they would accept. So in here we have a lot more heterogeneity compared to the people in the room. Here the largest group was about 26%, and they would accept up to 85% risk of moderate side effect in order to delay the progression for 2 years. But the second largest group is quite far, almost in the other extreme, and it's about 25% of people would accept up to 45%. These are people familiar with the disease, not per se patients, but this was performed together with Alzheimer's Research UK. So many of these people were either people diagnosed with some cognitive impairment or caregivers. So they are close to Alzheimer's disease. Well, I can elaborate a bit more on the study. We actually did not find differences across the groups, but I have to say that the risks were already really high, but there were no differences between the patients themselves and caregivers or people that had less experience with Alzheimer's disease. And when we go to the severe side effects, we actually see a similar, closer distribution to what we saw here. About 43% of people would only accept, or not only, but would accept up to 15% risk of side effects, but still more than half of the people would accept more than 15% risk of severe side effects in order to delay the progression for 2 years. So now we know a bit about the distribution of preferences in the room as well as in this other study, but we need to know what to do with this information. How can we use this information? And that's where Douwe will elaborate. Yes?
I have a question. There wasn't a choice to say 0%.
That's true, and that's...
Bias. Your conclusion is that 15%, the majority accepts 15%, but that's because there wasn't 0%.
Yeah, of course, here it's very summarized and it's very short, but actually how we discuss it is like it's up to that, which doesn't mean if we would go lower in the options, it's very likely, of course, that would also go lower. And we agreed that this is a very large percentage. This was based on previous information of focus group with patients, and it seemed an appropriate cutoff value. But we agree with you. We should maybe explore in the lower bound.
Yeah, so thank you, Sonia. So to add on that, so in the actual survey, so in the study that we did with the patients, the exercise was a bit different. So they had a slightly more elaborate exercise in the end to elicit, well, their maximum acceptable risk. But in order to make it not too complex, we simplified the procedure a bit. That's why in the end we opted to use these, let's say, relatively straightforward multiple choice questions. But that's indeed a bit of a simplification. So what I want to do next is actually to give a demonstration of how we could actually apply these results in performing an actual, what we would call a quantitative benefit risk assessment. And in order to make it a bit more concrete, we are going to do this in the context of a recently considered treatment, namely aducanumab. And it's a bit controversial, and the example is a bit stylized, so we have to make several assumptions in order to, let's say, use the data from the 2 clinical trials and combine it with our preference exercise. But it is more just to give an example. Well, as the majority of you probably know, is that we have aducanumab as a potential new disease-modifying treatment that was approved in the United States, but it did not get regulatory approval in Europe. So in that sense, there was a bit of conflicting opinions. Data was based on 2 large phase 3 randomized controlled trials, Engage and Emerge. They were essentially identical. So the study design was the same, but the results were different. I think in Emerge there was well, let's say some evidence for a positive beneficial effect with the treatment, whereas the other study was neutral. There the different efficacy measurements were not statistically significant. And I think initially the 2 studies were combined and were terminated early because of lack of efficacy. But then subsequently they did, let's say, an analysis per study, and that gave a slightly different picture depending, of course, on which study you were analyzing. We have a large number of patients participating. When we look at the outcomes, I guess, well, I'm not a clinician, but in Alzheimer's it's typical to use these cognitive tests as, let's say, main efficacy measurements. And also the primary endpoint in this particular study was one particular well, test measuring a combination of cognitive functioning and physical ability. And secondary endpoints were also, let's say, more MRI or imaging kind of based results. Well, and the most important side effects, as already discussed by Hans in one of the first slides during today's presentations, were, let's say, side effects areas. So these are kind of things that are visible on an MRI scan. And they were mainly classified into edema-related results, which are mainly transient, so they tend to go away after treatment is being suspended or terminated. And we had the area H events, which tended to have a more permanent characteristic. And what we did for the purpose of this exercise is kind of assume that these area E events are roughly equal to, let's say, our definition of moderate side effects, which is, of course, a bit of a simplification. And the same holds for the severe side effects. We were roughly saying area H events are severe side effects. Again, a bit of a simplification, because if you look at the clinical trial data, not all of these events were actually clinically severe events, right? So we make a bit of a simplifying assumption here. The major difficulty is actually going to be in the translation of these, let's say, performance measurements to our, let's say, measure of disease progression that we used in, well, the preference elicitation exercise. And that's something I want to discuss next when we're actually going to do the quantitative analysis. First of all, I have to make a bit of a promotion, so I'm sorry for that, but I, of course, need to show this slide. So, well, we've already been working on quantitative benefit risk assessment for many years now. And one of the tools that we developed in different IMI projects, mainly Protect and IMI Get View, is the so-called other software, which is actually a system that consists of a repository of aggregated clinical trial data, on top of which you can do various types of analysis, most notably meta-analysis or network meta-analysis, and also quantitative benefit risk assessment using a technique called multi-criteria decision analysis. And today we are going to focus on the final part, on the multi-criteria decision analysis component, which is also available as a standalone web application. So we are going to perform the exercise using our software. So I'm now going to change the PowerPoint to the actual software implementation. And just to prevent the system from logging me out, I'm just going to refresh it, sign in. And then we're hopefully fine. Yes, we are. And let's start with this particular table first. So I'm not going to explain all the details regarding the others MCDA software, but of course happy to answer any questions if needed. But our starting point is the so-called effects table that was also already illustrated by Hans. And he already explained the moderate side effects and the severe side effects. And I kind of just mentioned how we map those to the Area 8 events or the Area 8 events from the 2 phase 3 clinical trials. What is a bit different is when we look at the favorable effects, which in the clinical trial were mainly measured using these, let's say, tests of cognitive function and physical ability. And one of these tests, which is most closely related to, let's say, our definition of disease progression, is the so-called Alzheimer's disease corporate study and then the activities of daily living inventory. And that is a skill that is ranging from 0 to 53, where kind of lower scores mean a higher level of impairment. So essentially, the lower the score, the worse the performance. And one of the endpoints was the change in this particular score from baseline to week 78, the end of the clinical study. And then we see that for placebo, depending on the study that you're taking, but it doesn't differ that much, we have a change of, let's say, roughly 4 points. And then with the active treatment, we see a reduction a bit larger in engage versus emerge. Now, because we, let's say, our preference study was not really designed to perform a quantitative benefit risk assessment, especially for aducanumab, it had more a general purpose to kind of understand let's say, the maximum acceptable risks of people living with the disease or being, let's say, relative to somebody living with the disease. So that's why we used a slightly more, well, I would say, patient-friendly definition of disease progression. So the first step that we kind of have to take if we want to use our, let's say, results that we previously elicited from you guys, from the audience, we need to map, let's say, this favorable effect to the definition of disease progression that we used in our, let's say, survey. And for this, I have to make an assumption. And I'm going to make maybe a very bold assumption. I'm going to assume that every, let's say, 1 point change over here is going to delay the disease progression by 1 year. And by making this assumption, I would be able to map, let's say, these scores to, let's say, values related to disease progression. So I'm going to take this particular problem that we are going to use for our quantitative benefit risk assessment. And for now, I'm just going to take the data from the eMERGE trial. I mean, I could also have pooled the data or taken a range, but it doesn't really matter for the, let's say, purpose of the exercise. So this is our, let's say, effects table currently. We have exactly the same attributes as we used in our exercise. And in here we see a, delay in disease progression, median disease progression of 1.7 years when we change from placebo to aducanumab. But we also see a considerable increase in both moderate and severe side effects. And then the question is, of course, are we kind of willing to accept this increase in risk? And for this, we need to enter preference information. And, Sonia already very nicely presented the results. But let's enter those results into the other software. So, just to refresh your memory, we had this particular exercise. And if we compare treatment A against treatment B, we see that we have a difference in a disease progression of 2 years, right? So 6 years minus 4 years is 2 years. And depending on which response that we take, if we would start with the mean, then we would say that we are willing to accept a 45% increase here. So that would result in a difference of 15%, right? So if we take a particular, if we take this response, which was like chosen by 30% of the audience, then that would essentially mean that those who selected this particular response are willing to accept a 15% increase in moderate side effect for this 2 years increase in efficacy, right? So this is, yeah. Yeah, these are included. So this is a so-called maximum acceptable risk. So maybe I should have explained that a bit better. But indeed, it is kind of the maximum increase in risk that you are still willing to accept in order to take, let's say, the new treatment. So you're right. Those that are willing to accept 45% would also be willing to accept 35. So you can also look at this cumulatively. So what I'm going to do is now I want to enter this preference information into the system. So I'm now going to enter preference information. And for this I'm going to use the technique called thresholding, but that doesn't really matter too much for now. What we were considering in the exercise was a 2 years increase in the delay of the disease progression. Next, and we were kind of just concluding that when we were looking at the moderate side effects, depending on which response that we are taking, but let's go for the mode, that would be an increase in 15%. Right? We go from 30% for treatment A to 45% with treatment B. So that would mean that I enter 15% over here. Now, if we then go to the severe side effect, I think there the picture was a bit, let's say, more outspoken. There, the mode, even the majority, was saying, I'm only willing to accept an increase in that is 15%. So 15% would be an increase in 5% if I subtract the 10% for treatment A. So if I then enter that preference information, then for every 2 years delay in disease progression, we would be willing to accept an increase in severe side effects of 5%. Well, these reflect preference information. So I'm going to save those preferences. And now I'm going to perform the benefit risk assessment based on the data that we entered. And if we then, I'm going to present it in a kind of relative way. If we then look at the benefit-risk assessment, well, then this is the contribution actually that is favoring aducanumab. And this is the contribution of the benefit-risk balance that is kind of in favor of placebo. And you see with the preference information that we just entered, the benefit-risk balance would be extremely negative, right? It would be so much in favor of placebo that even if you were to perform the benefit-risk assessment only in terms of the moderate side effects, the conclusion would already be that the benefit-risk balance is negative, given the preference information that we kind of took into account in the exercise. And of course, if you would then end at the severe side effects on top, well, then it is really starting to look, let's say, dire for aducanumab. Things may change, of course, if we use different preference information, right? So suppose that instead of only going to looking at the severe side effects, instead of taking 15%, what if we take the other extreme? Still 6% of the audience we're willing to accept 65%, which would mean an increase of 55%. So I could select that as well, just to see how that is going to change the benefit-risk balance. So in order to do that, I'm going to do a sensitivity analysis, and I'm going to change this from 5% to 55%. And I'm just going to recalculate the benefit-risk balance with these new preferences. And, well, the benefit-risk balance won't really change because we didn't really affect or change our preferences for the moderate side effects. But then at least you see that the benefit-risk balance is getting slightly less negative. Well, I already explained we needed to make some simplifying assumptions, especially regarding, because we kind of assumed that each area A event or each area E event was actually a moderate side effect, and each area H event was a severe side effect. Well, if you look actually at the clinical trial papers, that's a bit of a simplification because not all of these events were actually symptomatic, right? So we may be overestimating that a bit. So what would happen if we kind of change the moderate and severe side effects? So suppose that it's not 35%, but let's say 17%. And I'm also going to reduce the incidence of the severe side effects. Let's also reduce it by half. And I keep the more dividing with the favorable effects. If I then recalculate the value profiles, the picture becomes a bit different. The benefit-risk balance is kind of still negative with these changes that I made to the data, but it is now kind of closer. So this gives you hopefully a bit of an idea how you can combine, let's say, clinical data from a clinical trial with preference information, either elicited, let's say, from a single decision maker, or in our particular case, let's say, an audience, or maybe, let's say, a group of patients. And for me, what is interesting is also the sensitivity analysis. They can kind of get a feeling of the boundaries, right? So this gives you then maybe a slightly better understanding of the benefit-risk balance, but also what are kind of the key underlying trade-offs that would make you, let's say, either positive or negative. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I think then Hans is going to let's say, close this particular session of us by drawing some conclusions.
Yeah, I will do it very briefly. I think that this is an example of a structured benefits framework, which at least from our perception is that, although it's for a regulator difficult to handle, to be honest, to be factual in their, let's say, in their discussion, but at least it could be helpful, it could support in the decision making, at least from our perspective. But at least this type of approach, you are asking explicitly value judgments about the contribution of the different components in your overall benefit risk. So in that case, it could be it will be, I think, an advantage if, and that's at least also the intention on the European level, that we try to move slowly, but very slowly, this type of direction, and at least try to make the assessors familiar with this approach of thinking. And in this context, I think also then the preference elicitation information from patients will be easier for them to incorporate also in their benefit risk assessment and final discussion and conclusion. Like I said, that the benefit risk analysis is explicit. It's not only clinical evidence, benefit risk, and etc., but it also incorporates more or less the risk attitude from the assessors, because what is always, at least for my interest is, we are with 27 CGP members, and we have to make a final discussion about, or a final decision about a certain product, and we are not always with 27 people on the same level of thinking. So this type of work could at least makes more explicit where the problems are in their, let's say, in their thinking or their risk attitude regarding the different type of attributes. So this type of information will be helpful, like stipulated on the slides, healthcare policymakers, prescribers and patients, and what has been presented also, I think, by Douwe, at least we try to make you familiar with it, that the difficulty is sometimes from patient-reported outcome measurements, how to accommodate this, that it also will also be, at least from a regulator perspective, useful to use it in his, let's say, in this assessment. So you need to make some assumptions, and that needs a lot of validation and at least discussion with each other, how to position this type of information. Just to give you an idea, QALYs is at first, although it is commonly used, for instance, with the reimbursement authorities, QALY is a difficult attribute because it is composed of different type of information, and it more or less combines all the different type of attributes in which a regulator, at least from his perspective, needs at least a discussion, because he has to go to all the different type of benefit aspects that might be important, comparing it with the different type of unfavorable effects. So favorable and unfavorable effects should be discussed separately, and it is very difficult to handle an overall estimate of for instance, QALYs, but at least this will give you the information, because we can extract, for instance, QALYs to health indexes, and health indexes you can incorporate in this type of thinking. Just to think about, is the way HTA is thinking, does that more or less reflect also, is it in similar way of thinking as we do on a regulator level? So this is, I think, what we would like to present. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks both, all three of you for really challenging a little bit, and you see that especially the sensitivity analysis I think are very interesting to see where is this tipping point in when I'm still happy. So I learned a lot about boundaries today. I'm also realizing that we are 10 minutes late. No problem, I think we have 2 pitches, and thereafter I will give a very brief conclusion so we can run for food and drinks. But I think I can ask Rosanne first. To give us a little bit more idea on how this actually works and can be applied. But now I probably need some help to get the mic. Pauline. If you read out. Kan iemand mee helpen? Want we moeten naar Rosanne. Ja, oké.
can also present without the slides, but maybe I will just start already introducing myself. So my name is Rosanne Janssens, and I'm a postdoc researcher at Regulatory Sciences Unit at the University of Leuven, the KU Leuven. So today we already heard Professor Isabelle Huys, and I will present on qualitative research in patient preference studies. Okay. So today I will here indeed present about the value of qualitative research on patient preferences. We already heard about quantitative studies and quantitative data in the latest presentation of Douwe, and Isabelle already presented about a framework including several methods to reach qualitative data and quantitative data from PREFER, and I will give some case examples or reflect on considerations from case examples, so patient preference studies where we had a qualitative research component, very important qualitative research component, and this was in multiple myeloma, so oncology field, Duchenne, and inflammatory bowel diseases. So first of all, an important question I think to ask ourselves is why to consider qualitative research and consider methods to gather qualitative data on patient preferences. And this is really to obtain insights from the patients bottom-up, in-depth insights into the breadth and the depth of elements that matter most to them. And so when we think about what matters most to patients, we can already have as non-patient stakeholders some hypotheses or some things that we can think about ourselves, but we can only know by asking really, sitting together with the patients and asking to them, what are your current experiences with the disease? What are your unmet needs? Where would you value treatment outcomes? What are important benefits to you? So can understand what are their unmet needs, but as well what are potential future treatment outcomes that they would value from treatments. Also, we can talk about what are trade-offs that they are currently facing with when they are taking their therapies, what are benefits that they would want from a treatment when they would accept a certain side effect, or the other way around, when or what type of side effect would they not be willing to accept in order to obtain a certain benefit. Also, by sitting together with patients and having really bottom-up open questions, asking them about, and especially in the context of novel treatments and therapies, about what uncertainties they would be willing to accept, unwilling to accept. We can learn this, all of this valuable information via qualitative research. And lastly, I have here on my slide again how do a basic, let's say basic question, but how do patients currently experience their disease, and how do they experience both the disease effects? What are disease effects that they experience? How does this impact their quality of life, as well as potentially side effects that they are currently facing, and how does this impact their quality of life? And here on the left-hand side of the slide, you see some top-level insights that we got from our patient preference study we conducted in multiple myeloma. So where we asked what are current symptoms and side effects that patients are experiencing and that are detrimental to them. And they listed and expanded on several elements such as pain, such a really pain, excruciating pain to the degree that morphine would not even help them in relieving this type of pain. So this, for example, represents an unmet need that patients with myeloma have currently, or also nerve or other bone problems that they experience that hampers them in performing their daily activities. So that is already one, I think, big rationale to consider qualitative research. Is really to gain insights into the depth and the breadth of patients' preferences, but also as a preparatory work for quantitative preference elicitation surveys. So when we conduct patient preference studies, we start our work with qualitative research, and then in this qualitative research, we try to derive the attributes and the levels that we investigate further into our quantitative research. So here you see the arrow reflecting both a qualitative study and a quantitative study. And what do we mean with a qualitative study? We include therein literature reviews to understand what is the prior preference research that has been conducted in a specific disease area. For example, inflammatory bowel diseases, there have been already likely prior preference research or not. We try to understand this, but also looking at clinical trial databases such as the EU Clinical Trial Register or the US Clinical Trial Database to understand what are the treatments that are currently in development, what are the endpoints and the outcomes that are being targeted in clinical development. And these insights we use to establish a patient discussion guide that we use in the futures in the next step, which is the individual interviews or group discussions with patients. And here we try to include both. We start our work by asking very openly about their disease, about what treatment effects they would value or would not value in both a positive and a negative side. And we also try to have them reflect on current side effects and current treatment effects that are being investigated in clinical development. And then as a final step of the qualitative study, we perform a thematic analysis where we involve different disciplines and different stakeholders, and importantly the patients' organizations, as well as if we can reach them, individual patients, which we involve in our study teams as well, to reflect upon what has been said during these discussions and to really derive the most important treatment attributes we include in a subsequent step, which is the quantitative study. And so here you see on the right-hand side of the slides, what we investigate in the quantitative study are the attributes and levels. And what we mean with attributes and levels, so it are the different treatment aspects that would influence a patient's decision, such as, for example, the type of therapy or risk of life-threatening side effects. And all of these elements we derive via our qualitative research. And the levels is on the right-hand side of the print screen, I will say, is how a certain treatment performs under a certain attribute. For example, for the type of therapy, it can be, in the case of Duchenne, it can be a corticosteroid, or in a potential future treatment scenario, it will be also including gene therapy. So these attributes, what we investigate in the quantitative study, and their levels we derive via qualitative research. There are several practical, let's say, considerations to take when designing the qualitative research, including how will we approach patients, what is the best discussion format, let's say. And so there are several choices that need to be made here. For example, do we use individual interviews or group discussion formats? Will we do it online or face-to-face? Especially now during COVID is an important consideration to take. How about the questions? We look in clinical trial registers, how we will ask patients about all of this in a way that makes sense, is relevant and accurate. And for answering all of these questions, we really need to involve a lot of stakeholders, and very importantly, the patients and the patient organizations, as well as clinicians. There are rules defined for attribute development which come from established research within psychological fields, also behavioral economics, as had been touched upon in earlier presentations. And so here they are listed some criteria for attribute development, which I think are very essential when designing preference surveys. So attributes should be meaningful and relevant from a patient's point of view, and should include all aspects that might be important to patient decision-making. When we leave out an attribute or an element that might be driving a preference, and we talk about the why patients choose for a certain treatment or not, that can bias findings because we did not include actually the most important elements. They need to be plausible, so next to what is really realistic for a patient to consider, clear and understandable in order to make sure that patients really understand what is meant with it, for example, impact of a certain treatment on their life. At last, it's mentioned that attributes should not significantly overlap. So how did our qualitative research make a difference according to us as a from a researcher point of view? So first of all, our qualitative work helped ensure that we included those attributes that were relevant from a patient's point of view. So by asking patients, for example, in inflammatory bowel disease, we discovered that fatigue or extreme tiredness was really something that would make them choose or not for a certain treatment, so to continue a certain treatment or to reject a certain treatment. And in the case, and for example, also decreased libido is something that is very delicate and a taboo. And only by having these conversations in a very good way, we can really reveal these types of things. In the case of multiple myeloma, we discovered also lots of things. For example, mobility problems, which is not only readily available in the literature, in previous preference studies, so we really needed to discover this. And then a second way in which we felt also that the qualitative research made a difference is by helping to ensure that the attributes were described in the preference survey in a way that is relevant and understandable and clear to patients. As you know, as you may have seen the survey in a small print screen, but if the attributes are not phrased in a way that makes sense to a patient and that is written in a way that patients can relate to this, then this will also decrease their attention towards the preference survey questions. And so it's important that we use language that is meaningful for patients without losing any of the accuracy, let's say. And also there, for example, because we also involve a lot of clinicians, we had first as a word, for example, in inflammatory bowel disease, ostomy included in an attribute description, and where it was finally rephrased towards a risk of undergoing surgery, as this was from a patient's point of view, the way that they conceptualize this attribute and attach meaning to it. In the case of multiple myeloma, we also first considered to include the word survival, but after many iterations with the patients themselves, we rephrased this as additional life expectancy in years. So my takeaways for conducting qualitative research in patient preference study is to view it really as a complementary component in patient preference study research. Is not one or the other in my view. It's really both of them to together give the most complementary in-depth insights into the patient preferences. Also that qualitative research, robust qualitative research can increase the understandability and the relevance of the attributes that have been selected in preference surveys, and therefore increase patients' understanding and by extent the internal validity of the findings. And then finally, from a practical point of view, is really to involve patients and patient organizations as key equal research partners in a preference study design according to their time and resources, of course. So thanks a lot. And with that, I conclude my presentation.
So there will be time to talk to the ladies during the drinks. So I think as these are pitches, Liese will now take us quickly through the next set. So I will not stand within your drinking time.
Thanks a lot. And noted, I understand that I'm the final presentation before we can move to the drinks and some appetizers. But today you already heard several speakers refer to the EMEA qualification or EMEA qualification opinion. So now in this final talk, I have the pleasure to dig a little bit deeper and explain what is this actually about? What is now a qualification and how was this conducted in the context of the IMI Prefer framework? So my name is Liese Barbier, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the group of Isabelle Huys, where I work together with Rosanne and other colleagues in the group of regulatory sciences and also in our patient preference research center. So, as you know by now, PREFER was a large IMI public-private partnership which was recently finalized, and in their work a lot of important outcomes were published. And one of them is actually the qualification opinion of the IMI PREFER patient preference framework and points to consider for method selection. So you can see there's also a link to the qualification opinion. It's publicly available, and it was made available in May 2022. So before we now go a little bit deeper, it's maybe useful to also reflect on what is now an EMA qualification. So actually, EMA qualification is a voluntary scientific pathway to establish the regulatory acceptability of a use of a novel method, in this case patient preference research, in the context of medicinal product development. An EMA qualification is a procedure, and there are two potential outcomes. The first one being qualification advice, where CHMP provides their assessment and advice on the methods proposed. And in some cases, and often, it can go to a next step, which is then qualification opinion, where CHMP formalizes their opinion and has this publicly available document with their assessment on the acceptability and context of use of that method in drug development. So how does this theoretical framework or pathway, how was it now applied in the context of IMI PREFER? Perhaps first, before we go farther, also indicate that also to make sure that you understand that it's not a single interaction between the regulator and the applicant. There is a very detailed and quite long process as well, I would say, that lays at the basis of this qualification. So you can see that normally it takes 250 days from submission of the dossier until a publication of the qualification opinion, and this is without possible request of clock stops from the applicant. So quite a long journey. So how is this journey now for the IMI PREFER project? So here the IMI PREFER project started with their EMA qualification endeavor already in end of 2018, starting with a pre-consultation, running all the way through qualification opinion, where the final opinion was published in May this year. So quite a long journey and a very journey with a lot of lessons. And as you see, it's a very iterative process with a lot of interaction between the regulator and the applicant via all these different steps. Something which was also very interesting of this particular qualification was that the two first steps were of a joint nature. So here it was not only CHMP, but also EUnetHTA who was involved in the joint assessment of what was submitted. So that also the results of it could not only be informative for regulatory decision-making, but also at the level of the HTA bodies. And then for the final step at the level of qualification opinion, it was only CHMP who was involved there. Also, I refer to the fact that it's also a learning process. That is very structured interaction between regulator and applicant. And it also reflected in actually the work of PREFER. In the beginning, the objective was to have a qualification of a particular method or a group of methods for preference elicitation, but in the end, it was the whole framework, the IMI PREFER framework, that was qualified together with points to consider for method selection. So this is the how, but now what was actually qualified? So this is the qualification opinion, and it consisted of two main parts. First, the PREFER framework for patient preference studies. This was also shown, this figure by Isabelle already earlier today. As you can see, it consists of three main components, which really focuses on how now to plan, design, conduct, and also analyze patient preference research studies, but then also reflecting on how can it be applied in the regulatory decision-making contexts. And then the second part is that it also contains a lot of information on the points to consider on method selection, which type of preference methods are available, and which ones are most suitable to answer a specific research question. And here also the 5 most promising methods were included. So in this outcome, CHMP reflected on this and also made this public in their opinion. And here I would like to highlight some of the qualification endorsement of the CHMP. So first of all, they considered the platform to be very useful to also stimulate interaction between the regulator and industry and also the different other stakeholders informed. And in general, or in principle, they endorsed the objectives of the framework, but also the different components and sub-elements of the framework. And they also appreciated the technical and methodological approaches that were made available via the IMI Prefer project, and also noted that it really provides a relevant spectrum of the different methods and points to consider for method selection in there. So while there was a positive endorsement, there were also some open topics which were raised within the qualification opinion. And these specifically relate to what is now a preference-sensitive situation, and do we need to, or do we want to make here a more clear definition about this or not? Secondly, they also indicated that how they use patient preference studies to inform the decision remains a matter of individual assessment on a case-by-case situation. And then thirdly, they also indicated that the methods included in the qualification opinion should not be seen as restrictive. It is rather a spectrum of different methods which are very useful, but it should not be seen restrictive in nature. So after what is now qualification and what was the outcome of the qualification opinion, why now do this? What is the value of an EMA qualification? Why did IMI Prefer do this? And also, what were the positive outcomes of this process? So first, of course, there's obviously the direct value of having that outcome, of having this publicly available qualification opinion of the framework. It gives insight in the regulatory assessment and opinion of the application of this novel method in medicine development, and also explicitly on its application of use in terms of endpoint selection, and also to inform the benefit-risk balance assessment. So hence, it has clear value for patients, regulators, but also for us researchers and also for developers. So first, for the patient, it helps to move the field from implicit to explicit patient input in the regulatory HTA decision-making. Also for the regulator themselves, it's a useful document because it provides considerations on how now to evaluate patient preference studies. How can it actually support decision-making? And also possibly it's the next step in further guideline development. For example, for further development of a component in the ICH reflection paper on patient-focused drug development. But also for the researchers, it contains a set of tools on how to now best design, conduct, and analyze patient preference studies. And then lastly, also for the marketing authorization holder or the developer, it gives advice on why, when, and how to now use patient preference studies and their results in decision-making along the drug life cycle. And also this qualification opinion gives more increased certainty or confidence that this information is also deemed valuable by the regulator and will be also taken into account in the assessment. So there is first the direct value of having this outcome, but there's also value from undertaking this process of EMA qualification. And this was also something which was very clear from the IMI Prefer qualification, where first of all, there's a very structured interaction, so a lot of going back and forth between the applicant and the regulator. And that this actually helps to build familiarity and understanding among the group of regulators and also in the group of the applicants. Secondly, which was also clear in the Prefer work, is that the advice from SAP, from CHMP, also informed the scientific approach and methodological considerations included in the patient preference framework. It's on the one hand redirected some research, and secondly had also an impact on the final Prefer recommendations. Thirdly, all the structured interaction also really pushes all the stakeholders involved to refine their thinking and crystallize their thoughts on the value and the regulatory applicability of patient preference research. And as mentioned by Hans as well, there are 27 CHMP members, so views on a regulatory level can also vary sometimes. So also this structured dialogue helped to build consensus among regulators. And then fifth and finally, the EMA qualification opinion, of that EMA qualification draft opinion is also opened up to public consultation, meaning that it's opened up to the broad general public for their comments. And also the final opinion is made publicly available. So also these actions lead to the fact that there's a raise in awareness and interest on the topic of patient preference research. So this brings me to my key messages. So this EMA qualification opinion is a very important step to propel the field of patient preference research, have a more structured conduct, have a more structured inclusion and evaluation of them in regulatory and HTA decision-making. It's not only the final outcome that is useful, but also the process, which really helps to clarify the applicability and also to increase familiarity and awareness. And then to end, also the qualification opinion and also the gathering of the views of all the different stakeholders serves also as a foundation for future research. So with this, I conclude my presentation and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Liese. That really gives us an idea of how that qualification process runs and how it can also be looked at from different perspectives, because I think also as a regulator, looking back on how you saw that is really important. I think we will have some more time to discuss it, and I think you answered the question that was there also earlier raised by the audience. So quickly rounding up, because indeed now I am the one standing in between the drinks and you. So I think we have had a very interesting afternoon. It was good to see a number of you here live in the room. I understand there were people also looking at the other side. Maybe they go into the garden, have their ice cream now and are laughing. But I think we had a really fun time also sitting here in the chairs and having a bit of a really talk in the break, which I appreciated. One thing that comes to mind to me is that we are still a bit in the stage of chicken and egg. Sjaak Bot really pushed us a little bit, the regulators at least in the room, to come up with the guidance, where the regulators say, yeah, but we need to understand first a little bit how to use it. I think Prefer gave us a bit of an idea of, okay, what are the possibilities, what are options in performing these kind of studies. And I do think that the ways and the methods are as familiar to the regulator as many of our other things that we use in trial assessment, etc. So it's really something that is worthwhile to have been exposed to. So I think that is really helping in getting this flywheel started. What everybody agreed on was what Stan was actually telling, so no-brainer, and actually also Cristina clearly, early stage interaction with patients, patient organizations really understanding that you can interact with researchers and make yourself available, and that is really important to shape your designs. And it's so great to hear even somebody working in the lab on PD and rats really thinking, okay, but this is what the patient really wants to achieve later on. And maybe just to translate also to the patient what you are doing, so that helps, I think. The other thing that I'm at least taking away is the boundaries, searching for that, the heterogeneity in if you do a patient preference study in the Netherlands or Turkey or Romania or US, outcomes may be a little bit different. Also the way you present the information, I think it was very clear. You have to make some assumptions and translate the attributes and the levels with which you are playing. But it gives you boundaries. It gives you, okay, where are we more or less? And I'm absolutely thrilled. 10 years ago, I was laughing always when Hans on the train was trying to show me ADDIS and playing with his computer and showing all these kind of graphs, and they changed all the time in what the outcome was. I think it really is getting somewhere, and it's really understanding, okay, if we put this in from the patient perspective, what they find of importance, and these are the results that we're seeing from different trials, where are we ending up? And I'm pretty sure that some of you of the industry here in the room are actually quite shocked in the end what you decided and did with the drug outcome and the value of that drug perhaps. Anyways, it really gives you an idea of, okay, what is important? And it may lead to, in some a bit further distance, I guess, Hans, that we really can predict a bit more the outcomes that are there made by the CHMP. And then, yeah, maybe to round up with, I was happy, Pauline, to see that my slide came back once more, and it was just poorly presented by me, but I had the question there, not just from the regulator perspective to approve the drug, but also if you want to take it as a patient and in the shared decision-making with the clinician. So with that, I think we've had a very, at least I have had a very interesting day, so one of us is happy. I don't see too many unhappy faces here, but if not, then drinks are on the RSNN, so welcome and thanks for your input, and especially thanks to the speakers.